Arthur felt the blood drain from his face, yet he refused to yield an inch. Despite the casual nature of the revelation, he could tell that the presence speaking through Sylvie was carefully studying his reaction. The same gleaming yellow eyes that had appeared innocent and confused only moments before now shone a vivid ruby carrying unwavering confidence and authority. Keeping his composure, Arthur asked whether Sylvie was safe while her body was being controlled. Agrona lingered on Sylvie's name as though savoring its sound before explaining that the voice Arthur was hearing came through a harmless spell he had implanted in her while she was still an egg. He assured Arthur that Sylvie was unharmed and merely asleep. 2 stone chairs rose from the ground. Arthur sat in one and gestured for Agrona to take the other. Agrona thanked him for the hospitality and expressed his appreciation that Arthur had managed to keep his wits about him. According to him, communication was much easier when the other party did not immediately attempt to kill him. Arthur pointed out that attacking someone while they were possessing his bond would hardly accomplish anything. With a sigh, Agrona admitted that he could not even use mana arts through Sylvie's body, but quickly brushed the matter aside. He explained that he had wanted to speak with Arthur for 2 reasons. The first was convenience. By finding Arthur here, he had no need to search for him and risk encountering the continent's leaders along the way. He remarked that seeing their reactions would have been amusing, especially if they discovered that he had infiltrated the most secure location on their continent. Arthur cut him off and asked about the second reason. A laugh escaped Agrona as he revealed that Arthur was the only person on the continent who interested him. Deep within, Arthur's thoughts turned uneasy. The leader of a rogue Asura clan taking an interest in him could not possibly mean anything good. Leaning forward, Agrona burst into laughter at the expression on Arthur's face. He reassured him that there was no need to worry, joking that he had no intention of suddenly pinning him down. Even if his preferences leaned that way, he added, it would still be rather inappropriate while using Sylvie's form. Arthur remarked that Agrona was far more eccentric than he had imagined. Agrona responded with amusement, questioning whether Arthur had expected some poised dictator draped in silk and obsessed with conquering the world. Arthur admitted that his expectations had been something along those lines. Agrona explained that he had to maintain a dignified image for his people. Having spent generations among lessers in Allocation, he had observed how their ethics shifted over time. He pointed out that public executions had once been considered entertainment only a few hundred years ago, whereas they were now regarded as horrifying. Dealing with such constantly changing standards, he claimed, was tiresome. Because of that, he left the handling of lessers to his followers, allowing them to adapt to those changing ideas of right and wrong. Arthur challenged him, asking what his own sense of morality looked like when his retainers had slaughtered soldiers with obvious enjoyment. Agrona immediately countered by reminding Arthur of Jagret's frozen corpse being displayed like a trophy. In his view, it was hardly fair for Arthur's side to claim any moral superiority. Within his mind, Arthur reluctantly considered the possibility that Agrona's words contained some truth. If they did, then Alakria was not the wasteland filled with lessers enslaved to the Vritra's every command as he had always believed. Agrona noticed the direction of Arthur's thoughts and remarked that Arthur likely found it strange that he genuinely cared about lessers. Arthur responded by recalling what the Asuras had told him, that Agrona had been breeding and experimenting on lessers long before his exile from Ephaiotis. Stretching his arms, Agrona dismissed the accusation as a half-truth. He pointed out that Kezis and his subordinate had never explained the true reason behind those actions. Arthur questioned whether that reason was not simply the creation of an army powerful enough to challenge the other Asuras. Agrona appeared surprised that this was all Arthur had been told. He asked whether Arthur truly believed he had simply awakened one day with the desire to commit genocide against his own kind. Arthur remained unmoved, stating that no explanation could justify what Agrona was attempting to do. Agrona replied that he should have expected Arthur to share Kezes's mindset. He then painted a hypothetical scenario, asking Arthur to imagine living on Dicathen without magic. In that world, the royal families Arthur knew would never spare him a glance. His peers from Xyrus would never have become his peers at all because he would never have attended the academy. Agrona asked how Arthur would feel in such circumstances. He explained that basilisks had long been infamous among the other races, but Arthur should imagine something worse, being looked down upon by his own clan simply for lacking talent. Even Lord Indrath, who had shown Arthur favor, had not considered Agrona worthy of acknowledgement. different. Arthur scoffed at the comparison. He questioned whether this imagined version of himself was supposed to make him sympathize with Agrona. Regardless of the circumstances, he argued that it could never justify playing with countless lives for the sake of personal power. Agrona calmly countered with a question of his own, asking whether Arthur mourned every ant he stepped on. A weary sigh escaped Arthur. Deep down, he realized he had been naive to believe this conversation could remain rational. Agrona continued without concern. He declared that the results of his experiments had benefited every lesser in Alakria. According to him, the people worshipped him not out of fear, but out of reverence. In their eyes, he was their savior. Arthur sharply questioned whether Agrona had erased their memories of the killings and torture inflicted upon their ancestors. Agrona dismissed the criticism. He claimed that even the test subjects themselves would be grateful that he had made use of them. What truly mattered, in his view, was that their descendants and future generations would inherit the rewards born from those sacrifices. Within his mind, Arthur reached a grim conclusion. This egotistical madman genuinely believed that everything he was doing was right. Arthur demanded to know what Agrona had accomplished that could possibly justify experimenting on the people of Alakria. Agrona responded with a question of his own. He reminded Arthur that, in Dicathen, the ratio of mages to non-mages was roughly 1 in 100. Then he asked Arthur to guess what that ratio was in Alakria. A smirk spread across Agrona's face as he revealed the answer. 1 in 5. The number hit Arthur like a shock. He shot to his feet, stunned by the implication. Agrona seemed delighted by the reaction, teasing Arthur with obvious amusement and taking satisfaction in how impressed he looked. Arthur stared at him in disbelief and questioned what his ultimate goal was. Everything he had heard sounded insane. Agrona merely replied that insanity was relative. Arthur admitted that he had assumed Agrona wanted his help or was attempting to recruit him. Laughing, Agrona dismissed the notion. He remarked that Arthur made many assumptions while lacking answers, then decided to provide some himself. He reminded Arthur of the attack at the wall and revealed that Arthur's parents had remained unharmed because he had personally willed it. He then addressed the Asura's silence toward Dicathen's leaders. According to Agrona, several Asuras, including Alder and Winsome, had attempted to infiltrate his castle in Alakria. Arthur immediately asked whether that meant the treaty had been broken. Agrona shook off the idea. Neither he nor the Asuras of Epheotis wanted the treaty destroyed. Instead, they had reached a new agreement. When Arthur pressed for details, Agrona's grin widened. Under the new arrangement, the Asuras were forbidden from aiding Dicathen in any capacity throughout the war. Winsome, Aldir, and the rest of the Asuras had effectively abandoned both Dicathen and its people. Arthur began demanding to know why Agrona was telling him all of this, but Agrona interrupted before he could finish. He explained that Arthur had asked about his goal. While convincing Arthur to willingly join his side would be pleasant, his immediate objective was much simpler. He wanted Arthur to remove himself from the war entirely. Before Arthur could reject the proposal, Agrona urged him to consider the situation carefully. He explained that he had deliberately conducted the war conservatively so far, avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties because those lives still held value to him. However, he warned that this restraint would not necessarily continue. Agrona pointed out that Arthur had barely survived until now, and that the conflict was only beginning. He questioned the likelihood of Dicathen's victory and whether Arthur's family and loved ones would still be alive when everything was over. Then he presented his offer. Arthur could hide, seek refuge in Alakria, or do whatever he wished, provided he never stood against Agrona's army. If Arthur guaranteed that, Agrona would guarantee that both he and everyone he cared about would remain untouched. Silence settled between them, and Agrona patiently waited for an answer, but Arthur did not know what to say. Every instinct told him to refuse. He should refuse. Yet for reasons he could not fully explain, Agrona's words carried a weight that forced him to genuinely consider them. Breaking the silence, Agrona repeated his condition. Arthur simply had to avoid becoming an enemy of his army. In return, he and his loved ones would be protected. He advised Arthur to think carefully and revealed that he would leave a spell with Sylvie so that Arthur could deliver his answer later. Agrona also warned him not to take too long. The war was about to enter its next phase, and he assured Arthur that the coming developments would not favor Dicathen. Arthur then returned to an earlier statement. Agrona had claimed that Arthur was the only person on the continent who interested him, yet he had never explained why. Agrona considered the question for a moment, tapping a finger against his chin. Finally, he decided there was no harm in revealing the reason. With casual ease, he explained that he had enjoyed speaking with one of Arthur's old friends, King Grey. A curse slipped from Stefan Vale's lips as one of the shields lost his footing and nearly vanished beneath the stampeding herd of mana beasts. Immediately, he barked orders for the shields to maintain their defensive panels and prevent any of the beasts from breaking away from the pack. Once satisfied that they had been properly reprimanded, his attention returned to the mysterious black ore resting in his hand. His orders were simple. After the beasts had been successfully relocated to the Elshire forest, he was to crush it. Within his mind, Stefan reflected on the exhausting journey from the northern beast glades. Even so, he considered the effort worthwhile. In his eyes, even unads had their uses. The death of one of them was preferable to the loss of a mage. Drawing upon the power of his crest, Stefan enveloped his body in protective mana and gave the order to charge. The non-mages surged forward amid a deafening storm of war cries and clanging steel. Not a trace of hesitation or fear could be seen as they rushed toward death. At heart, Stefan found Dicathen magic peculiar and versatile. Even weaker mages could reinforce themselves with mana, but he dismissed the advantage. To him, this mission was nothing more than an easy opportunity to earn greater accolades and elevate the standing of his bloodline. Leading mutant mana beasts was far more exciting than the tedious covert assignments he had endured before. Confidence swelled within him as he watched the soldiers advance. He believed his presence alone inspired them. Though many were older than he was, their runes were insignificant compared to his own. His father might never claim a legendary regalia, but Stefan was certain that he would. Once he entered the Relictum's vaults himself, he was convinced that he alone would raise House Vale above all others in Vekr, perhaps even throughout Alakria. His attention was soon drawn to a young elf. She carried no weapon, yet deadly blades of wind formed around her, slicing through several beasts with ease. Instantly, Stefan chose her as his target. He ordered Seren to focus the shields on him while remaining at a safe distance with Mari. Ashton was instructed to stay near them and continue relaying information about his position should he find himself in danger. Increasing his pace, Stefan channeled mana through his crest and drew a sword enhanced by a powerful instiller. Jagged flames erupted along its edge. His blade crashed through the elf's attempt to parry. He felt it strike a protective layer of mana before cutting into flesh. A volley of arrows followed from behind, and he ducked low. Secretly pleased, Stefan noted that the elf had barely managed to reinforce herself with mana in time. Everything he had heard about Dicathen mages seemed true. They possessed versatility, but they were slow. Around him, other mages had already engaged the enemy elves. The battle was rapidly shifting in Alakria's favor. His soldiers kept the elves occupied, while the mana beasts rampaged unchecked through the battlefield. As he closed in on the wind mage once more, Ashton's voice echoed in his mind. The report indicated that her mana signature was somewhat unusual, but she appeared to be around the lower range of a mid-tier mage. Mari was already preparing a single target spell, and Ashton advised caution while promising to signal when it was time to move. Stefan slowed to a measured walk. Sheathing his sword, he circulated additional mana through his crest. Fire erupted around him, forming a suit of blazing armor. 4 jagged sickles of flame materialized and floated at his sides. Just as he entered range to unleash them, Ashton's warning rang through his mind. Without hesitation, Stefan dropped flat to the ground. An arrow crackling with the force of lightning tore through the air above him. He knew better than to trust his shield against an attack like that. Within his mind, he concluded that the battle needed to end quickly. Spending excessive mana on a single opponent was wasteful when countless enemies still remained. For the first time, he truly understood the value of having a sentry supporting him, even an inexperienced one. Despite possessing no offensive or defensive abilities, their battlefield awareness made them indispensable. No wonder they were considered so valuable. To conserve mana, Stefan dismissed his flame-clad form and drew his sword, intending to finish off the elf. The blade nearly slipped from his grasp. A terrifying presence suddenly seized his very soul. Ashton's panicked warning echoed in his mind, urging him to leave immediately. Stefan wanted to obey. More than anything, he wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee like prey sensing a predator. Yet his body refused to respond. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at his chest as his breathing became impossible. Within his mind, he desperately questioned the source of the overwhelming, suffocating pressure crushing him. Then its owner appeared. A figure landed before him. Striking blue eyes, radiating immense power, looked down at him with visible annoyance. Stefan was the son of Carnal Vale, heir to House House Vale. Yet before this boy, who appeared no older than himself, those titles meant nothing. He was not a warrior. He was not a leader. He was not a mage. He was nothing. Arthur slowly surveyed the battlefield around him. The once vibrant forest had been transformed into a gruesome landscape stained with blood and littered with corpses. Even the thick fog hanging over the area failed to conceal the devastation left behind. One of the wounded elf soldiers thanked Arthur for his assistance. Her voice was rough with pain, and she winced as she attempted to bow. Arthur shook his head and apologized instead. He stated that the tragedy could have been avoided had he arrived before the mana beasts reached the forest. Deep within, Arthur's thoughts drifted back to his conversation with Agrona. He wondered if this attack was what Agrona had meant when he warned that the war was entering its next stage. He also found himself questioning how the council would respond. This had been the first assault on Elven territory. Even though the attack had ultimately been repelled, it had already accomplished its purpose. Later that day, an encampment of elven soldiers occupied a small clearing that looked strangely unnatural. At its center stood a wooden tent protected beneath a swirling dome of wind, causing the fabric walls to ripple and sway continuously. Inside, agonized screams filled the air. Stefan repeatedly demanded to know what had happened to his arm, desperately shouting for answers. His right arm had been severed. Thick bandages covered the wound, while restraints bound him securely to a chair. The moment Arthur stepped through the barrier, his ears were greeted by the voice of an enraged young man hurling empty threats. Stefan arrogantly demanded his release, proclaiming his noble lineage and distinguished family status while insulting his captors. The tirade ended abruptly. Arthur's hand struck across Stefan's face with a sharp crack, snapping his head to the side. For a moment, the young Alacrian could only stare in stunned disbelief. Then outrage erupted from him. He stammered in shock at being slapped before attempting to demand Arthur's name and threaten retaliation. Before he could finish, Arthur seized him by the collar. With a firm grip and an unyielding gaze, Arthur informed him that he clearly failed to understand the gravity of his current situation and declared that he was about to enlighten him. Thin tendrils of lightning crackled around Arthur's fingers as he grabbed the boy by the forehead and pressed down against his temples. Panic immediately overtook Stefan. He struggled against the restraints, demanding to know what Arthur was doing and pleading for him to stop. Ignoring the protests, Arthur carefully guided strands of lightning mana through the boy's brain and nervous system. Minutes passed as he maintained precise control over the spell until it finally produced the desired effect. A horrifying scream erupted from Stefan's throat. His body thrashed wildly against the chair as unbearable agony consumed him. The sensation felt like being engulfed in flames. Arthur coldly explained that the pain was the result of confused nerve endings. To Stefan's mind, the manipulated signals created the illusion that his entire body was burning. After several minutes, Arthur gripped the boy's head once again and removed the sensation. The relief was immediate. Between trembling sobs, Stefan begged for mercy. Shock rattled his entire body as he desperately asked why Arthur was doing this and offered anything in exchange for the torment ending. Without a trace of emotion, Arthur demanded his name. Stefan initially questioned why it mattered, but the sight of Arthur merely raising his hand caused him to break. Terror overwhelmed any remaining resistance, and he quickly identified himself as Stefan Vale before pleading for the pain not to return. Arthur then turned the interrogation towards Stefan's family. He stated that the Vale blood appeared to be a prominent lineage and asked whether that assessment was correct. Stefan immediately confirmed it. Arthur informed him that cooperation would ensure his survival. The quality of his treatment, however, would depend entirely on the honesty of his answers. He demanded confirmation that Stefan understood. At that moment, Arthur unleashed his mana. The pressure of a white core mage filled the tent. Thick roots and branches forming the structure groaned, cracked, and splintered beneath the overwhelming force. Stefan stammered out his understanding without hesitation. Satisfied, Arthur ordered him to identify every member of House Vale and explain their relationship to him. Stefan quickly listed the names. Lucia Vale was his sister, Izora Vale was his mother, and Karnal Vale was his father. Within his mind, Arthur immediately recognized the name Karnal Vale from Udo's memories. Without dwelling on it, he moved on to the next subject and asked about the awakening process. Stefan explained that awakening was the ceremony through which a child's first mark was unlocked, allowing them to become a mage. Arthur then questioned the distinction between a crest and a mark. For a brief moment, Stefan found himself wondering how Arthur possessed any knowledge of marks and crests at all. Still, he answered, A crest was superior to a mark. It granted a greater understanding and mastery over the specific branch of magic associated with the mark. Privately, Arthur concluded that the most effective way to gather information was to act as though he already knew the answers and merely sought confirmation. Continuing the interrogation, he asked what rank existed above marks and crests. Stefan explained that emblems came after crests, while regalias stood at the very top. Arthur immediately followed up by asking how regalia holders compared to retainers in strength. Fearfully, Stefan admitted that he did not know. The strongest mage within his family possessed only an emblem. He desperately insisted that he was telling the truth, swearing upon the name of Vritra. Inside, Arthur scoffed at the declaration. The people of Alakria treated the Vritra as though they were gods. Returning to the interrogation, Arthur asked how many emblem and regalia holders were currently present in Dicathen. Stefan shook his head. He explained that his own commander was an emblem holder who served beneath a regalia holder, but he did not know the exact numbers involved. Within his mind, Arthur assessed the information. Stefan was simply too low ranking to possess truly valuable intelligence. Judging by his knowledge and position, House Vale was likely a blood of lesser status. Stefan blinked frantically and revealed that their assault had not been the only attack on the forest. Several other Alacrian troops were already heading north. Arthur turned and began walking away. Panic immediately overtook Stefan as he desperately pointed out that the information he had provided was valuable. He pleaded for his release, reminding Arthur that he had answered every question truthfully and that a promise had been made. Arthur calmly reminded him that he had never intended to kill him. With those final words, he left the tent. Outside, waves of elven soldiers were arriving at the camp. Some carried wounded comrades drenched in blood, while others transported the remains of those who had fallen. Arthur stepped beside Lena Amaris and informed her that he was finished. He left the fate of the Alacrian prisoner entirely in her hands. As Arthur walked away, a faint glow spread through the forest with the arrival of dawn. Allowing his thoughts to drift, Arthur avoided thinking about the task awaiting him. As it had repeatedly over the past few days, his conversation with Agrona replayed in his mind. He had also kept Agrona's appearance a secret from the council, including Virion. Leaning against a tree, Arthur released a long sigh. Deep within, he questioned whether he should have informed the council about Agrona. No one else knew about the threat looming over them. Only he and Sylvie were aware of it, and Sylvie knew only because hiding his thoughts from her had become increasingly difficult. He hoped she was adapting well to her new body and abilities. Now that he had reached the white core stage, he had gained greater control over his dragon's will. At least leaving her at the castle had been the right decision. Agrona's words echoed relentlessly through his mind, reminding him that the test subjects had served their purpose and claiming that Winsome, Alder, and the rest of the Asuras had abandoned both him and Dicathen. Exhaustion gradually crept over Arthur, and as his consciousness faded, memories from his previous life surfaced. A sharp sting across his cheek jolted him awake. His eyes snapped open to a blinding light shining directly into his face. Behind the fluorescent glare stood a dark silhouette calling out to Gray and checking whether he could hear. Disoriented and suffering from a dry, burning throat, Gray groaned as he demanded to know where he was and who they were. Ignoring his questions, another voice asked what he remembered last. His head pounded as he struggled to gather his scattered memories. Eventually, he managed to sort through them and recalled having just won the tournament. The voice pressed for more. Gray remembered accepting an offer to be mentored by a powerful individual, deliberately keeping his answer vague in hopes that it would not draw attention. The questioning continued. He was asked to identify the powerful woman and explain the nature of their relationship. The fact that they already knew the mentor was a woman made Gray suspect that this was some sort of test and that his interrogators likely already possessed the answers. With no alternative, he admitted that he only knew her as Lady Vera and that he had just met her. The larger man immediately accused him of lying. The thinner man calmly asked what had happened after the tournament victory. Gray hesitantly claimed that he had been heading back to his dorm room. The accusation of lying came again. The larger man seized Gray by the neck and lifted him into the air. Demanding the truth, the man insisted that Gray reveal which organization had sent him to protect the legacy. The terms made no sense to Gray. He could not understand the accusations being thrown at him. Yet with his throat crushed in the man's grip, all he could do was struggle helplessly and choke for air until the thinner companion struck the larger man's hand away. Still bound to the chair, Gray toppled to the floor under its weight. The thinner man ordered that Gray be stripped while he went to retrieve white phosphorus. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The larger man sneered before tearing away the worn shirt Gray had been wearing. The thin man stated that he believed Gray possessed information they needed. Fortunately for Gray, that meant they needed him alive, at least for the time being. He explained that if Gray truly was who they suspected, then he might have prepared for such a situation. If they had made a mistake and their evidence was nothing more than coincidence, then the experience awaiting him would be unbearably unpleasant. Confused and frightened, Gray demanded to know what they were talking about. The thin man assured him that the process would be simple. Smiling faintly, he dipped a gloved finger into a metal tube and remarked that he would not even begin with questions. He spread a streak of shiny silver paste beneath Gray's ribs before producing a lighter. Panic surged through Gray. He begged the man to stop and desperately asked what he was doing. The man offered no response. He simply lowered the flame onto the silver paste. The moment the fire touched the substance, agony beyond anything Gray had ever imagined exploded through his flesh. Tears streamed down his face as he pleaded for mercy, but the man remained silent and ignited another patch of the dreadful substance. Gray screamed again. Even after his voice failed him, the screams continued within his mind. His thoughts shifted from fearing death to desperately hoping for it. Death itself seemed preferable if it could free him from the agony. Broken by the pain, Gray weakly promised to tell them anything they wanted. He offered everything he knew, his voice reduced to little more than a whisper. Satisfied, the thin man stated that this was much better. He explained that he would tell a story, and Gray would fill in the missing pieces if he wished to avoid experiencing the same torment on more sensitive parts of his body. He demanded confirmation that Gray understood. Unable even to gather enough saliva to swallow, Gray simply nodded. The interrogation began. The man recited Gray's background, identifying him as an orphan, whose records showed that Headmaster Olivia Wilbeck had overseen his care since infancy. He noted that the orphanage had been the closest thing Gray had ever known to a home, and asked whether he was correct. Gray nodded once more. Continuing, the interrogator revealed the true focus of his interest. He questioned what military institution had trained Gray to serve as the legacy's protector, pointing out that no such training appeared anywhere in the official records. Gray insisted that he had only completed his second year at Vithal Military Academy and had received no prior training whatsoever. The man challenged the claim, questioning how someone without training could defeat two skilled Chi combatants. Gray admitted that he had received help from his friends, but maintained that his statement was true. The interrogator then questioned whether Olivia Wilbeck, whom he described as calculating and cunning, would truly allow the legacy to move openly in public, accompanied only by two ordinary children. Desperate and confused, Gray pleaded once again, insisting that he had never even heard of the legacy they kept mentioning. The man leaned closer and revealed that only two answers truly mattered to him. He wanted to know which organization had sent Gray to protect the legacy, and how deeply the country of Traden was involved in assisting that effort through the public announcement of Lady Vera as Gray's mentor. Gray could only plead helplessly and insist that he did not know. The interrogator released a heavy sigh and spread another line of paste across Gray's cheek. He explained that he had hoped Gray would keep his promise and cooperate. Every hesitation only convinced him that Gray was inventing answers. Gray prepared himself to beg once more. Then he slowly realized that someone else had entered the room. Before he could fully process it, the larger man suddenly collapsed after receiving a swift strike from the newcomer. The thin interrogator immediately retaliated with an unseen weapon, only to be violently hurled away. The third figure calmly approached Gray and switched off the blinding light. White spots clouded Gray's vision, and he blinked repeatedly until his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The newcomer assured him that he was safe now. As his sight cleared, Gray finally recognized the person standing before him. It was Lady Vera. Arthur abruptly snapped out of the memory. Without hesitation, he shot high into the sky. Powerful winds roared past him as he soared above the clouds. Reaching the white core stage had granted him many advantages, and among them was the ability to manipulate ambient mana with enough precision to achieve flight. Within, Arthur admitted that the sensation of flying was exhilarating. Given General Aya's experience within the forest, he believed Lena and her elven forces would be in better hands with her. Although he should have been heading back to the castle, the transmission scroll contained enough information about the Alacrian prisoner to serve for the time being. The view felt different without Sylvie flying beside him. He knew she would worry once she learned he had experienced another dream from his former life. He would update her upon his return. For now, now, he intended to go where he was needed most. Upon reaching the Grand Mountains, Arthur gradually descended through the vast sea of clouds until the battlefield below came fully into view. Streams and bolts of magic in countless colors rained from the wall, while soldiers fought fiercely beneath it against hordes of beasts that had survived the relentless bombardment. Continuing his descent, Arthur carefully observed the many different creatures spread across the battlefield. The wall endured battles day after day as Allocation forces continually attempted to break through its defensive line. Although Arthur had read numerous reports detailing the attacks against the fortress, this was the first time he had witnessed it with his own eyes. A sudden flash behind him caught his attention. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw a massive blast of fire racing toward him, large enough to engulf his entire body. A trace of annoyance crossed his mind as he casually swatted the spell aside, dispersing it with ease before continuing his descent. Landing on the upper levels of the wall, he softened his arrival with a cushion of wind and found himself facing a crowd of kneeling soldiers. At the front stood a broad-chested man clad in full armor. The officer immediately offered a sincere apology for his subordinate's mistake. Since no notice had been received regarding a lance's arrival, the soldier had assumed Arthur was an enemy. He promised that the man responsible would be reprimanded and punished accordingly. It had been a long time since Arthur had received such treatment. For a brief moment, he privately enjoyed the sight of so many heads bowed before him. He dismissed the need for punishment, explaining that he had arrived unannounced from the Beast Glades, and that the assumption had been reasonable. He even commended the soldier's vigilance. However, he firmly instructed that any unidentified threat should be reported to superiors immediately in the future. The soldier instantly sprang upright into a salute and acknowledged the order. Arthur then turned toward the officer he assumed was in command and requested his name and position while walking toward the stairs. The man identified himself as Captain Albenth Kelris of the Bulwark Division and hurried after him. Arthur acknowledged the introduction and stated that it was time to discuss strategy. As they descended the stairways, Captain Albenth explained that his division consisted primarily of workers and blacksmiths responsible for the wall's maintenance and construction. Arthur observed that the constant stray attacks against the structure must keep them occupied. Albenth confirmed this indirectly by explaining that his duties involve submitting daily reports concerning repairs, resources, and supplies. Looking around, Arthur admitted that the entire operation was impressive. Deep down, he found the name The Wall somewhat misleading, considering it was far more than a simple defensive barrier. The sounds of tools striking stone and steel, blended with shouted instructions, hurried footsteps, and the constant movement of both soldiers and workers. Albenth apologized for the overwhelming noise, explaining that he had been told newcomers often found it difficult to adjust to. Arthur agreed that it was indeed overwhelming, but he also expressed regret that it had taken him so long to visit the place for himself. Captain Albenth explained that the floors ahead were accessible to civilians as well. As they approached a guarded passage, he flashed a badge to the soldiers stationed there. The guards immediately saluted their captain, though their uncertain gazes lingered on Arthur. Albenth sharply rebuked them, demanding to know whether they had been taught to stare in the presence of a lance. The armored soldiers' eyes widened in alarm. Realizing who stood before them, they instantly bowed in unison. Arthur dismissed the matter with a smile and assured them that a simple salute would have been sufficient. A moment later, Arthur noticed the scent of burning in the air and asked if there was a fire nearby. Albenth explained that they were passing through the wall's main forge. After descending another flight of stairs, an enormous smithing operation unfolded before them. Although narrow vents near the ceiling carried away much of the smoke, the entire level remained shrouded beneath a dense dark haze. Arthur watched as two smiths worked in perfect rhythm, rotating and positioning a piece of glowing metal while a massive iron wedge repeatedly hammered it from above. The machine responsible for the strike stood within a solid framework nearly as large as Boo. In his mind, Arthur marveled at the engineering hidden within the wall. The mechanism closely resembled an old steam-powered hammer from Earth, leaving him briefly puzzled before realizing the answer. Gravity magic was powering the device. Nearby, several dwarven metal mages shaped metal ingots as though they were soft clay. The sight was both fascinating and strangely unreal. Albenth interrupted Arthur's observations by asking him to endure the heat a little longer, assuring him that their destination was close. After leaving the forge behind, Albenth remarked on the wall's remarkable nature. Arthur wholeheartedly agreed. The infrastructure and population had expanded tremendously in only a few years. What stood before them was no longer merely a military fortress, but a place with its own thriving economy. Albanth enthusiastically explained that because military service was not mandatory, rewards were offered to adventurers who volunteered their assistance. The arrangement benefited both sides. Adventurers earned easy money while the wall gained capable mages and fighters. Although occasional friction arose between soldiers and adventurers, everyone understood that the true enemy existed beyond the wall. Surveying the rows of tents and merchant stalls spread across the lower levels, Arthur guessed that the merchants were there because of the adventurers. Albanth confirmed the observation. Despite strict taxes and restrictions preventing them from operating along the main supply routes, merchants continued arriving in large numbers. Their eagerness to earn profit benefited everyone. Without them, the wall would have needed to provide food, clothing, weapons, and entertainment for thousands of mercenaries. Instead, the cycle sustained itself. The wall paid the adventurers spent their earnings with the merchants, and the collected taxes helped fund future payments. In the end, everyone made a living while sharing a common interest in defending the wall. Arthur praised the system as brilliant. It was an ingenious use of available resources and reflected exceptionally well on the senior captain responsible for managing the city-like fortress. Albanth remarked that flying directly to the destination would undoubtedly have been faster, but he hoped the tour had helped Arthur become more familiar with the wall. Arthur expressed his sincere appreciation for the effort. They continued walking for several more minutes before arriving at a quieter section of the fortress. An unusually large canvas pavilion stood against the mountainside, surrounded by several guarding mages. Gesturing toward it, Albanth explained that it served as the meeting place for captains and division heads. Arthur had arrived at an ideal moment, as a meeting was already underway. In fact, Albanth had been preparing to head there just before Arthur's arrival. Arthur remarked that he was fortunate to have arrived when he did, despite the fireball that had greeted him. Albanth let out a chuckle and remarked that there was never a dull moment at the wall. Flashing his badge once more to the guard stationed outside the pavilion, he informed Arthur that Senior Captain Trotius was inside along with the other captains and several division heads. The name stirred a vague sense of familiarity in Arthur's mind. As the guards pulled open the canvas flap, Arthur followed Albanth inside. 7 individuals sat around a circular table, their battered armor and disheveled robes bearing clear signs of the ongoing war. All of them were bent over a map, engrossed in a strategic discussion. Standing at the far end of the table was a man who seemed to embody the image of a traditional gentleman. The moment he noticed Arthur's arrival, he halted mid-sentence and rose from his seat. With a respectful dip of his head, he welcomed General Arthur Leywin and expressed his honor at having a lance present. He then invited Arthur to take a seat and introduced himself as Trotius Flamesworth, the senior captain in charge of the wall. The meeting resumed shortly afterward. One captain reported that there were currently 5 units operating within the region and another 3 farther east according to their most recent transmissions. As he spoke, he pointed toward the relevant markers on the map spread across the table. Trotius turned his attention to Captain Kruer and questioned how accurate the projected timeline for clearing the dungeons was. Kruer replied that it was fairly accurate and began explaining the factors involved. Trotius immediately cut him off, stating that a week was too long. Throughout the meeting, Arthur carefully observed Trotius Flamesworth. Trotius pointed out that the number of corrupted beasts assaulting the wall continued to increase. Because of that, he declared that each dungeon could be allotted only 4 days for clearing operations. Kruer protested at once, arguing that forcing expeditions to move that quickly would result in significantly higher casualties. Arthur could not entirely shake the negative impression he carried from everything Jasmine and Hester had told him about the Flamesworth family. Meeting Trotius in person left him sensing a cold and cautious demeanor, yet Arthur reminded himself that he had come to the wall as a lance, not as Jasmine's friend. Kruer continued his objections, explaining that some of the dungeons had never been cleared before. Without exercising extreme caution, entire units could be wiped out. Trotius responded without hesitation. He reminded everyone that the wall stood as the last line of defense on the eastern border, and that their forces were already stretched thin. If a soldier died deep within the beast glades, that soldier's family remained safe. However, if the wall became overwhelmed because too many troops were tied up proceeding cautiously through a single dungeon, the consequences would be far worse. More lives would be lost at the wall itself. The beasts and the Alacrian mages controlling them would then advance unhindered toward the nearby towns. For that reason, Trotius reaffirmed the 4-day limit and made it clear that the decision was in order. Within, Arthur admitted that Trotius might be a terrible father with an icy personality, but his leadership appeared sound. Moving on, Trotius requested an update regarding the new routes being prepared for the Trailblazer division. The mention of the division immediately brought Tessia to Arthur's mind. Albantha reported that the 4th tunnel had recently been secured. It was the longest tunnel constructed so far, with its entrance concealed within a small crevice along a riverbank. Although a team of Earth mages was still reinforcing the structure, it should become accessible to Captain Kruer's units within the week. Trotius immediately issued another order, instructing Albantha to pull a quarter of the workers from their current duties and place them on night shifts instead. He reminded everyone that another underground route had been flooded only the previous week after its location had been exposed. Because of that, securing additional subterranean passages had become a priority. He then requested an update regarding the search for new teleportation gates. Albantha reported that only a single unit had been assigned to scouting for gates, and that more time would be needed before any meaningful progress could be made. Curious, Arthur asked about these teleportation gates. Trotius explained that the wall faced constant attacks and required a steady flow of reinforcements every day. At present, the safest method of reaching the Beast Glades involved traveling through underground channels. However, those tunnels were often unstable and marching through them was both slow and dangerous. That situation would improve once the train connecting the wall to Blackbend City was completed. With direct access to the city's teleportation gate, transportation would become significantly more efficient. If additional gates hidden within the Beast Glades could be discovered and connected to Blackbend City's gate, troops could be deployed instantly rather than spending hours navigating underground routes. Arthur questioned how they could be certain that any teleportation gates even existed within the Beast Glades. Trotius admitted that they had no such certainty, which was precisely why only limited resources had been committed to the search. In his mind, Arthur reflected on the nature of teleportation gates. Like the floating castle in Xyrus City, they were relics left behind by the mages of antiquity. Massive stone arches covered in indecipherable runes stood as remnants of a forgotten age, with entire cities often built around them. Modern artificers had discovered methods for linking gates together and altering their destinations, but constructing an entirely new gate remained far beyond contemporary capabilities. Arthur then asked what method the scouting unit was using to locate the gates, assuming they were not simply wandering through the wilderness blindly. Trotius explained that teleportation gates continuously emitted faint fluctuations of mana particles. Because those fluctuations occurred across the entire elemental spectrum, they blended seamlessly into the environment and were exceptionally difficult to detect. Arthur immediately compared the process to the time he had searched for Darv. Detecting deviations in ambient mana through Realm Heart had already been difficult. Searching for fluctuations spread across every elemental attribute while flying over the entirety of the Beast Glades would be an enormous waste of time. That was especially true when there might not be any gates hidden there at all. Breaking free from his thoughts, Arthur simply acknowledged the explanation. Trotius then apologized for making Arthur sit through the lengthy meeting and remarked that they would conclude it shortly. Arthur stopped him before he could end the session. He stated that before the meeting concluded, he wished to share everything he had learned regarding the enemy forces. The explanation did not take long. Arthur relayed the information obtained from interrogating the Alacrian prisoner and supplemented several missing details with knowledge he had acquired from Uto's memories. When he finished, the room fell into thoughtful silence. Trotius eventually remarked that the information was intriguing. He focused on Arthur's description of Alacrian magic, particularly the claim that their mages possessed highly specialized and limited methods of mana manipulation. Seeking clarification, Trotius questioned what prevented a striker, for example, from shaping mana into a ranged attack despite the limitations Arthur had described. Captain Kruer agreed with Trotius's concerns. He explained that he could not simply pass such information to his troops without confidence in its accuracy. If the assumptions about Alacrian limitations proved false, soldiers could be injured or killed by abilities they had been told were impossible, such as a striker launching a ranged attack or a shield forming a mana blade. Arthur responded that complete certainty was unnecessary. He instructed them to share the information only with division heads and have them observe the enemy firsthand. Alacrian magic functioned very differently from the magic used in Dicathen, but different did not automatically mean superior. They needed to study those differences and exploit any weaknesses they discovered. He also informed them that the council would be expecting reports detailing observations regarding the enemy's potential potential limitations. Afterward, Arthur explained everything else he knew about marks, crests, emblems, and regalias. He concluded by expressing hope that the information would provide an advantage in future battles, assuming its accuracy could be verified. With nothing further to add, Arthur stood and excused himself. Not wanting to remain inside any longer than necessary, he left the pavilion. After the relative quiet of the meeting tent, the walls seemed even louder and busier than before. Vendors loudly advertised their goods from tents and carts, while laborers, soldiers, and mercenaries moved through the crowded pathways. Most of the wares Arthur saw were food or equipment suited to a life spent in constant conflict. Within, Arthur recalled the reports describing the wall's growing makeshift city. Many families lived there, especially the families of soldiers and merchants. Existing on the very edge of an active battlefield placed enormous strain on everyone. The desire for even the smallest comforts was evident everywhere. For those willing to look closely, the tension was impossible to miss. It lingered in the hurried footsteps and lowered gazes of exhausted laborers. It surfaced in the brief, uneasy exchanges between merchants and adventurers. Most of all, Arthur saw it in the way everyone acted as though they were unafraid. These people understood the threat posed by the Alacrians better than almost anyone else. While chewing on a skewer of charbroiled meat with a texture similar to chicken thigh, Arthur wandered from stall to stall, stopping whenever something caught his attention. His thoughts drifted back to the meeting. Even after hearing explanations about marks, crests, emblems, and regalias, the officers had clearly struggled to accept just how different Alacrian society and magic truly were. Arthur could only hope that the information would still provide an advantage in the battles ahead. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, he started considering his next move. Then a deep horn echoed through the distance. Nearby merchants immediately began discussing it among themselves. One recognized it as the Southern Evening Patrol. Another dismissed the patrol as a waste of resources, arguing that every available soldier should be deployed toward the Beast Glades. A third merchant countered that the patrol likely existed to ensure the safe arrival of the next supply convoy after the losses suffered the previous week. Someone else argued that losing a few supply carts would mean little if the Alacrians managed to break through the front lines. Listening to the debate, Arthur reflected that concentrating all forces in a single location was one of the fastest ways to lose a war. With that thought, he decided it was time to return to work. Meanwhile, only a few miles from the wall's gate, a convoy slowly approached. Carriages pulled by mana beasts rolled forward in a long line, while armed mages and warriors marched beside them with weapons already drawn. Among them were Arthur's parents and the members of the Twin Horns. All of them wore the same exhausted, grim expressions. Their worn appearances reflected the hardship of the journey as they trudged through the gates alongside their carriage. Without warning, the mana beasts pulling the convoy rattled nervously as their instincts screamed of approaching danger. Reynolds immediately raised the alarm, warning everyone to stay alert because something was coming. A deafening explosion erupted directly atop one of the carriages, abruptly halting the convoy's advance. The carriage overturned, spilling supplies across the frozen ground. Angela quickly climbed out and unleashed a streak of wind toward the source of the attack. She spotted the enemy first. An Alacrian mage stood in the distance, protected by a mana shield that effortlessly blocked her attack. Jasmine immediately moved toward the attacker, twin daggers already in hand. At the same time, Angela raised her wand and formed a protective barrier of wind around their group. Durden pressed his palm against the ground, channeling earth magic. Jagged stone formations burst upward around them, creating additional defenses. Reynolds demanded to know where the enemy was hiding and ordered everyone to prepare for battle. Above all else, the supplies had to be protected. Helen immediately instructed Durden to remain focused on defense while creating an elevated position for her and Angela. Responding at once, Durden raised towering pillars of stone from the ground. Helen and Angela climbed atop them, gaining a clear view of the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Alacrian mage launched a barrage of fire toward Jasmine. She charged directly through the assault without hesitation. Her twin mana-infused daggers shot forward, piercing through the incoming flames and forcing the enemy mage to erect a shield. The daggers struck the barrier and deflected away. At the same moment, Helen's arrows streaked toward the Alacrian from another direction. High above the battlefield, a second Alacrian mage appeared atop a mana beast and moved toward Helen. Focused on attacking the first enemy, Helen failed to notice the threat until Angela shouted a warning. Before the mounted mage could strike, Durden launched a volley of stone projectiles skyward. The rocks pierced the mana beast's body, forcing it into a rapid descent. The rider leaped free just before impact. The dying beast crashed into the battlefield and was impaled upon one of Durden's jagged stone spikes. The airborne mage narrowly avoided avoided an incoming arrow before retaliating with a storm of ice shards aimed at a nearby adventurer. Helen caught sight of the attack and urgently called for Reynolds to stop him. Reacting instantly, Reynolds unleashed a burst of fire. The ice shards melted away before reaching their target, saving the adventurer. Without slowing down, Reynolds clenched his fist and charged forward. The Allocation mage conjured an ice dagger and spun around, slashing across Reynolds' wrist. Blood sprayed from the wound. The mage demanded that Reynolds move aside. Ignoring the pain, Reynolds flatly refused. As the confrontation continued, Helen released another volley of arrows. They rebounded harmlessly from a shield erected by the first Allocation mage. Then another barrage arrived. A stream of wind blades swept toward the mage, forcing him to abandon shielding his companion and focus entirely on protecting himself. The opening was all Reynolds needed. Flames engulfed his clenched fist as he surged forward. Bam! His punch struck with devastating force, piercing straight through the Allocation mage's abdomen. As the battle finally settled, Reynolds looked around and noticed a silhouette emerging through the lingering mist of ice. Arthur stepped forward, dragging the unconscious body of the remaining Allocation mage by his cloak. Calmly, he explained that he had intentionally left the man alive for questioning. He also instructed that soldiers be sent to retrieve the fallen manhwa beast so it could be studied. The twin horns and Arthur's parents stared at him in stunned silence. Confused by their reaction, Arthur simply questioned what was wrong. The next moment, Reynolds burst into laughter and wrapped an arm around his son. Amused, he admitted that moments like this reminded him all over again that Arthur was a lance, something he seemed destined to keep forgetting. After the reunion, Arthur and the others continued through the gates alongside their carriage. Behind them, a soldier shouted for the gates to be closed, and the enormous structure rumbled shut once the final carriage had entered. It was Arthur's first time seeing the twin horns fight in years. Watching them in battle had reminded him just how well they complemented one another. Each member instinctively played to the other's strengths while covering their weaknesses. Years of shared experience and countless adventures were evident in every movement they made. Yet Arthur could not help wondering how many more battles they could endure before the war finally took its toll on them. Alice looked as though she was about to say something. Her mouth parted in surprise, but the words never came. Instead, the weariness on her face softened into a gentle smile. A short distance away, they found a large, dilapidated building that boldly advertised itself as the most popular inn for miles around. Once they were seated, Reynolds remarked that he could no longer sense Arthur's core at all and questioned just how powerful his son had become. Arthur casually revealed that he had reached the white core stage not long ago. Reynolds immediately burst into loud laughter and proudly announced the news to everyone in the inn. Helen responded with an impressed whistle, while Jasmine gave an approving nod. Reynolds merely smirked and looked between Arthur and his companions with unmistakable pride. His son. Even though Arthur knew his parents regularly made deliveries to and from the wall, he had never expected to run into them there. Sharing a meal with both them and the twin horns felt like a fortunate coincidence. During the conversation, Reynolds mentioned that they sent transmission messages to Ellie every time they returned to Black Bend. Surprised, Arthur noted that Ellie had never told him about that. Reynolds jokingly attributed it to Ellie being in a rebellious phase. Alice smiled and explained that most of Ellie's replies consisted of brief assurances that she was alive and doing fine. Despite that, she still worried about her daughter constantly and wondered whether Ellie was eating properly and making friends. Arthur pointed out that if they were truly that concerned, they could simply visit the castle. He suspected that was what Ellie wanted most. Helen explained that security surrounding the castle had tightened considerably. Access to its teleportation gates was restricted to division heads and higher-ranking individuals, and even they could only enter while conducting official business. Arthur immediately offered a solution. He explained that he could personally accompany them. Together they could travel to Black Bend and then make the jump to the castle. Alice gently declined. She insisted that they did not want to burden him. Besides, an underground transportation route was currently being constructed. Once completed, it would allow them to visit both Arthur and Ellie much more frequently. Arthur remained unconvinced. He pointed out that reports indicated the journey from Black Bend was becoming increasingly dangerous. The battle they had just fought was proof enough. Reynolds brushed the concern aside. From his perspective, nothing serious had happened. No one had suffered major injuries, and the Allocations had barely managed to touch him. Arthur immediately challenged that reasoning. That might have been true this time, but there would always be a next battle. The previous encounter had already left Jasmine and Durden unconscious. Ellie worried about them constantly, and so did he. There was a moment of silence before Angela suddenly sprang to her feet, realizing with alarm that she and Helen had never taken their belongings out of the carriage. Helen's expression shifted from confusion to realization, and then to startled concern. Agreeing that they needed to retrieve their things before they were stolen, she quickly urged the others to come along. Together, Helen and Angela ushered away a confused Durden and an irritated Jasmine. As they left, Alice turned to Arthur and reminded him that while their responsibilities were not on the same scale as those of a lance, they were still doing their part to help win the war. They were working toward ending the conflict just as he was. Arthur argued that they were putting themselves in danger. Alice countered that everyone in Dicathen was in danger while the war continued, including Arthur himself. Anger flared within Arthur as he insisted that he could handle the danger. Reynolds abruptly slammed his utensils onto the table and scolded Arthur like a child. He demanded to know whether Arthur realized how hypocritical he was being. Reynolds challenged the idea that Arthur alone could risk his life while Ellie, Alice, and he remained hidden away somewhere safe, abandoning their responsibilities to their kingdom. Arthur argued that he was fighting the war to protect them, but he could not remain by their side at all times. He feared what might happen if something happened to his father or mother while he was away on a mission. Even Ellie's intense dedication to training came from her desire to join them, and Arthur could not help but fear the possibility of losing her as well, just as they had lost Adam. Reynolds sharply cut him off. Rising from his seat, he fixed Arthur with a fierce stare and declared that while protecting his family was his highest priority, he also wanted them to live happily. That was the reason they had chosen this path. Dicathen might not have been Arthur's only home, but it was the only home the rest of them had ever known. If preserving a better future for Ellie required sacrificing his own life, then he was willing to accept that fate. With that, Reynolds stormed away and Alice followed after him. Before leaving, she cast Arthur a solemn glance but said nothing. Arthur remained seated in silence for a moment before standing. Reaching into his robe, he withdrew several gold coins and left them on the table. Moments later, he launched himself from the balcony and flew away. His mind clouded with conflicting emotions, Arthur made his way to a rocky ledge high in the mountain beside the fortress, where he could overlook the wall. He allowed the sharp winds to bite into his skin, enduring the discomfort as punishment for the foolish anger he had directed toward his parents. Arthur did everything he could to avoid replaying the conversation. He wanted to vent his frustration by hunting a few corrupted beasts, but the night remained quiet. Enhancing his vision with mana, he searched the surrounding area. He found no mana beasts, but he did sense someone approaching from below. Several minutes later, a familiar voice drifted upward through the darkness. A hand suddenly appeared over the edge of the ledge and grabbed hold of the rock. Jasmine complained about Arthur's habit of flying off without considering those who could not fly. She pointed out that this was where he had disappeared to the previous night and informed him that they had spent the entire day searching for him. When they had returned to the inn, the owner had been anxiously worrying over the mess Arthur had left behind. A faint smile appeared on Arthur's face as he apologized and remarked that he would send a gift as compensation. Curious, he asked how she had managed to find him. With quiet confidence, Jasmine warned him not to underestimate his mentor. Arthur replied that he never had. Jasmine then asked how long he had been stationed at the wall. Shivering from the cold, she listened as Arthur explained that he had arrived only a few hours before the rest of them. At the same time, he wrapped them both in a layer of fire-infused mana to keep the cold at bay. Jasmine quietly thanked him. After a brief pause, she asked whether he had gotten the chance to meet her father. Arthur explained that he had interrupted one of her father's meetings and then asked whether she had seen him herself. Jasmine admitted that despite her many trips back and forth, she had not seen him even once. Another stretch of silence passed before Jasmine spoke again. She assured Arthur that she would not pry into what had happened at the inn, but she wanted him to understand that his parents genuinely cared about him and Ellie. She pointed out that whenever Reynolds met someone new, he always found a way to mention that his son was a lance and how proud he was of him, admitting that she found it a little annoying. Despite himself, Arthur smiled and acknowledged that he already knew they cared. Jasmine went on to explain that Reynolds, and especially Alice, carried a great deal of guilt. No matter how many times others had told them otherwise, they could not shake the feeling that Adam's death was partly their fault because they had not been there to help. When Arthur remained silent, Jasmine continued. She reminded him of what had happened to Alice before his birth. After the tragedy involving Lenza, Alice had been deeply traumatized and, for a long time, could barely bring herself to use magic for anything beyond treating minor injuries. Flicking a stone off the ledge, Arthur replied that he knew all of that. That understanding was exactly why he had expected his parents to remain safely within the castle until the war ended. Instead, they had thrown themselves into the heart of the conflict, traveling traveling repeatedly through dangerous lands and fending off attacks. Jasmine interrupted before he could continue. She explained that what his parents were doing was not only for him and Ellie, but also for themselves. They were trying to overcome their past mistakes and fears so they could become better parents. Arthur admitted that he understood. Looking back on it, he realized he had been selfish as well. In his mind, all three of them simply needed time to adjust. Jasmine then urged him not to allow his relationship with his parents to become like her relationship with her own family. She reflected that there had once been a time when reconciliation had been possible, but she had chosen to keep running away. At the same time, her father's pride had prevented him from reaching out and apologizing. Arthur turned toward her and quietly thanked her. Jasmine immediately remarked that he had better be grateful because her jaw was sore from all the talking. The complaint carried just enough dryness to make Arthur smile. Despite her words, the conversation continued. The two spent the night exchanging stories. Some were lighthearted and amusing, while others were heavy and serious. Arthur spoke about his time with the Asuras, his victory over the Vritra retainer, and Sylvie's human form. In return, Jasmine shared stories of the Twin Horns' adventures. They remained there for the entire night, catching up on everything they had missed. As the first rays of sunrise cast a golden halo over the mountains, Jasmine finally announced that it was time for her to return. Arthur smiled and thanked her for everything. Jasmine responded with only a nod before patting him on the head. Arthur watched as she descended the mountainside. A gentle gale swirled around her, cushioning each landing as she effortlessly hopped down the rugged slope. As her figure gradually disappeared into the distance, Arthur closed his eyes and let out a slow sigh. The conversation had lifted a weight from his shoulders, leaving his mind calmer and far more at ease than before. The castle loomed overhead, standing starkly against the solid gray sky. Inside, Ellie encouraged a weakened Sylvie to keep trying. Sylvie struggled to stand on her own, her body wobbling unsteadily. Frustration filled her as she insisted that she could not do it and pleaded for Ellie to move closer. Ellie refused, insisting that Sylvie needed to walk farther without help. Letting go of the table that had been supporting her, Sylvie pushed herself harder and began taking shaky steps toward Ellie. Ellie started praising her progress, but before she could finish, Sylvie's strength gave out. As Sylvie stumbled forward, Ellie immediately rushed to catch her. Instead, both of them crashed onto the wooden floor. The pair burst into laughter as they looked at each other, giggling despite the fall. Again and again, they repeated the exercise, and little by little, Sylvie regained some of her strength. Later that night, Sylvie made her way toward the castle kitchen. The head chef was busy baking cakes when his attention briefly shifted elsewhere. Taking advantage of the moment, Sylvie peeked at the pastries arranged on a nearby table. She quickly grabbed a few before slipping out of the kitchen. As she walked back through the halls, she wondered to herself how Arthur managed this all the time. Simply using mana for normal walking felt exhausting. Approaching Ellie's room, she heard Ellie rehearsing something aloud. Ellie repeatedly corrected herself, insisting that she was ready rather than merely thinking she was ready, then immediately questioned whether she sounded too desperate. Peeking inside, Sylvie asked what she was doing. Startled, Ellie quickly claimed that it was nothing. In reality, she had been imitating Sylvie's earlier attempts at walking. The sight was so ridiculous that Boo burst into laughter. Sylvie chuckled and reminded Ellie that they should head downstairs since Arthur would be arriving soon. When they reached the lower levels of the castle, Arthur finally arrived, thin wisps of steam rising from his soaked clothes. The moment he spotted the two familiar girls, a smile spread across his face. Ellie welcomed him back, but pointed out that he was completely drenched. Since he was soaking wet, she suggested that they simply pretend they had shared a hug. Arthur immediately rejected that idea, and with a mischievous grin, pulled his sister into his arms. Ellie let out a cry of dismay, protesting that she had just finished bathing while struggling to escape his embrace. After finally releasing her, Arthur looked towards Sylvie and remarked with satisfaction that his fearsome dragon was growing into a healthy young girl. Through their telepathic bond, Sylvie quietly asked whether something had happened. Arthur responded with an awkward smile, telling her that they would talk about it later. After conjuring a wave of heat to dry himself off, Arthur left the crowded room with Ellie and Sylvie. As they walked through the castle halls, Ellie proudly announced that she had advanced into the light red stage while he had been away. She eagerly added that combined with her daily training regimen alongside Boo, she had become a fairly capable conjurer for her age. Even Commander Virion had praised her abilities and suggested that she might be able to skip the soldiers' mandatory training. Whenever Ellie spoke so enthusiastically about joining the army, Arthur usually felt an immediate urge to stop her. This time, however, he simply offered a friendly smile and nodded. Deep within, Arthur noticed how much bolder Ellie had become about her desire to enlist. His thoughts drifted to their parents. He had not gotten the chance to speak with them again before leaving, and he could not help but wonder what they would say about Ellie's growing eagerness to fight. Perhaps if they were here, Ellie would not be so determined to join the war. Ellie went on to explain that Princess Kathleen had been incredibly helpful as well. Kathleen had been sparring with her regularly and assisting her with mana manipulation. Arthur pointed out that he could always teach her magic whenever he had free time. After all, he had once been a professor at Xyrus Academy. Ellie immediately reminded him that his teaching career had lasted only a semester. Although she appreciated the offer, she admitted that learning directly from him would probably discourage her rather than help. Confused, Arthur asked why. Ellie explained that despite being only 4 years apart in age, they shared the same blood. Yet Arthur was already a white core mage and a quadra elemental. If he became her teacher, she knew she would inevitably compare herself to him. The words struck Arthur hard, but what hurt most was the subdued acceptance in her voice. Sylvie gently patted Ellie on the shoulder and reassured her that Arthur's talent was considered an anomaly even among the Asuras. Comparing herself to someone like him was unfair. Arthur scratched the back of his neck and objected to being called a freak. Looking back over her shoulder with a smirk, Ellie declared that, in this particular regard, the description suited him perfectly. Not long afterward, Arthur and Sylvie parted ways with Ellie and continued toward the meeting room. Arthur had hoped to spend more time speaking with his bond, both about the changes to her body now that the seal had been broken, and about the obligations that still needed to be fulfilled. As they approached the chamber, the guards opened the doors and allowed them inside. Seated directly across from the entrance was Bundamog Lonuid, the dwarf who had once taught Arthur magic. The dwarf greeted the young lance with his usual flat tone. Grinning, Arthur observed that the endless meetings appeared to have taken a toll on him. Bund groaned dramatically and stretched his stout body, claiming that his backside had not suffered this much since the days his mother used to whip him as a child. Arthur greeted the councilmen and councilwomen with a respectful nod. Priscilla Glader welcomed him, remarking that he had arrived at a good time. Blaine agreed, explaining that they had been waiting for his return so they could continue discussing his report. Arthur blinked in confusion. Continue? A smug telepathic message from Virion immediately reached his mind, asking whether Arthur had truly believed he could escape the meeting. Arthur responded with complete disbelief, reminding Virion that he had already sent a transmission scroll containing all the necessary information. Ignoring his complaint, Virion formally addressed him as General Arthur and asked for confirmation that his report described 2 separate but coordinated attacks near El Noir. Taking a seat, Arthur dryly confirmed that this was exactly what his report had stated and added that he had nothing new to contribute. Blaine wasted no time moving the discussion forward. He proposed maintaining their current military deployments while sending reinforcements to the Elshire Forest only when circumstances required it. Marial immediately challenged the suggestion. She argued that a strategy of providing aid only when necessary implied that Blaine did not consider the Elven territory worthy of proper defense. Blaine immediately accused Mariel of twisting his words. He argued that the recent incident had been the enemy's only known incursion into Elven territory, while the wall endured attacks almost every day. In his view, it should have been obvious that protecting Sapan's borders had to take priority. Alduin countered that no one was suggesting the defense of the Elshire Forest should come before Sapan's. However, just as Elven soldiers had been stationed at the wall to help protect Sapan, he believed there should be some form of permanent defense along the forest borders as well. Priscilla disagreed. She pointed out that the Elshire Forest itself served as a natural defense. The mana-laden fog had deterred outsiders for as long as anyone could remember. In her opinion, the attacks from the previous day would have eventually failed even if no one had intervened. The Alacrians and corrupted beasts would have become lost within the forest and died long before reaching any of Eleanor's cities, even those nearest the border. Frustration erupted from Alduin. He argued that the forest was still part of the kingdom of Eleanor, and that Elven tribes continued to live outside the cities. Following Priscilla's logic, he claimed, they might as well abandon the wall and sacrifice Sapin's border cities simply because protecting less land would be easier. Blaine immediately fired back. He dismissed the comparison as completely unreasonable and argued that if Sapen fell, even if only its outermost cities were lost, the Alacrians would gain a direct path into the heart of Eleanor as well. Marielle's expression hardened. She warned Blaine to watch his tone and accused him of acting as though the elves owed Sapen a debt. She reminded everyone that Eleanor had already sent its mages to help defend Sapen's forces against the Alacrians. Had even a quarter of those soldiers remained behind to guard the forest, she argued, the current debate would not even be necessary. Priscilla remained firm. She reiterated that despite the Elshire Forest being part of Elenoir, not a single elven city or even a town had experienced battle. Alduin responded that all they were requesting was the return of some of their soldiers so they could defend their homeland. Blaine immediately rejected the notion. He reminded Alduin that those soldiers were no longer solely Elenoir's men. His voice rose with fury as he declared that the council had been created to unite the three races against an external threat. Their responsibility was to remain impartial and guide the entire continent toward victory over the Alacrians. Alduin refused to back down. He shot back that Blaine spoke endlessly about impartiality while remaining completely focused on what benefited his own kingdom. Before the argument could escalate any further, a powerful wave of mana exploded throughout the chamber. Virian's commanding voice cut through the room as he ordered everyone to stop. The sudden pressure silenced both sides instantly. Virian stated that he had heard enough from both parties. Before they degraded themselves further by behaving like spoiled children, he intended to speak. After a brief pause, he laid out his conclusion. Based on the consistency of enemy attacks, Sapen remained the Alacrians' primary target. The most direct route to the major cities of both Sapen and Elenoir ran through the northern range of the Grand Mountains and the Wall itself. Therefore, they would continue operating under the assumption that the Alacrians understood this as well and would keep concentrating their efforts on that front. As for Elenoir's defense, Virion proposed a compromise. Several Trailblazer units would be relocated to the dungeons near the southern border. Should another enemy incursion occur through the Elshire Forest, those units could emerge and provide immediate support. The heated chamber gradually settled as Virion's decision brought the argument to an end. Blaine assured Alduin that there was no need for concern. He emphasized that the Elshire Forest was a vast maze and that its mana-laden fog remained a powerful deterrent. As things stood, he believed Elenoir would remain safe. Although Alduin nodded, an uneasy silence settled over the room. Taking advantage of the pause, Arthur spoke up. With the matter of Elenoir temporarily resolved, he informed the council that he wished to update them on everything he had learned from the latest interrogation. Arthur proceeded to recount all the information he had gathered from both the battle and the captured Alacrian soldier, covering everything from their runes to their combat methods. After listening, Virion concluded that Dicathen had been underestimating the capabilities of Alacrian mages. Blaine immediately disagreed. In his view, the revelation that Alacrian mages possess such limited magic versatility suggested the opposite. Rather than underestimating them, he believed Dicathen had been overestimating them all along. Alduin found himself agreeing with Blaine for once. To him, the information revealed a clear weakness in Alacria's combat doctrine. Elder Bunch shook his head. He acknowledged that their specialization might appear to be a weakness at first glance. However, based on Arthur's findings, the Alacrian methods of awakening and training mages seemed far more advanced than those practiced in Dicathen. Curious, Mariel asked him to explain. Bund admitted that his thoughts were speculative, but he believed the system of marks and crests revealed a fundamental difference in philosophy. Rather than mastering a wide variety of spells within their elemental affinity, Alacrian mages appeared to devote their entire lives to perfecting a single spell and its countless evolutions and variations. As a result, while Dicathian mages pursued versatility, Alacrian mages became highly specialized experts. On the battlefield, Bund argued versatility was not always more valuable than having soldiers who excelled at one task to an extraordinary degree. Because of that, he recommended that the information be distributed to military captains, guilds, and academies across the continent so they could develop more effective ways of combating these specialized opponents. Arthur informed them that he had already stopped at the wall and relayed the information to the captains stationed there. Virion approved and shifted the discussion toward the deployment of their forces. As Arthur had expected, the meeting quickly devolved into yet another lengthy debate. Council members argued over where resources were needed most, repeating many of the same disagreements that had surfaced earlier. Bund made it clear that he and his loyalists would oversee the eradication of Alacrian sympathizers within Darv. Unfortunately, the enemy had already exploited the tunnel network to move troops toward the Darv-Sapam border. To make matters worse, Alacrian ships had been spotted along Sapane's western coastline. As a result, Telmor, Etistan, and Maber needed to strengthen defenses not only on their eastern fronts in case the wall fell, but also along their western borders. Alduin once again raised concerns regarding Eleanor. Given the recent incursions from the Beast Glades, he argued that the Alacrian troops operating in the north might actually have been moving east toward Elven territory. After further discussion, the council agreed to dispatch Elder Camus and Aya to survey the southern border before committing larger military forces. Varian remarked that this arrangement would serve as a temporary solution until Lord Alder and the other Asuras contacted them again. Arthur immediately corrected him. He revealed that the Asuras would no longer be able to provide any assistance throughout the war. Winsome, Aldir, and the rest of the Asuras had abandoned both Dicathen and its people. Arthur then informed the council that he had additional news regarding that situation. The revelation caused Varian to erupt. Slamming both hands onto the table, he loudly cursed the Asuras for their arrogance. Furious, he condemned them for using Dicathen and the war to serve their own purposes. What angered him even more was that they had broken their own treaty by attacking the Vritra and still failed to achieve their objective. Rising from his seat, Varian began pacing across the room. His thoughts raced through the implications. Experiments. 1 in 5 mages. There had to be more. Demanding answers, he pressed Arthur for every detail Agrona had shared. Mariel's sharp voice cut in before Arthur could respond. She focused on a different issue entirely and demanded to know how Arthur had received a message from Agrona in the first place. Arthur explained that Agrona had temporarily possessed one of the captured soldiers in order to relay information. The word alone shocked Mariel. Within his mind, Arthur carefully concealed the truth. Sylvie still knew nothing about Agrona's control over her body, and Arthur believed it was better for everyone to assume the possession had occurred through another Alacrian. Keeping his expression steady, Arthur explained that Agrona had used the failed assault as leverage, demanding that the Asuras of Ephiotis sever all communication with Dicathen. Bund remarked that the news at least explained why they had not encountered more scythes and retainers. In his view, Agrona had deliberately kept his strongest soldiers in Alacria in case an event like this occurred. Mariel immediately raised another concern. If that was true, then the next question was whether those forces would now come to Dicathen. The Alacrians had hidden teleportation gates within the dungeons of the Beast Glades. She feared that the retainers and scythes might already be somewhere on the continent. Priscilla responded by pointing out that there had not been a single teleportation gate sighting in months, not since the last gate had been destroyed. She recalled reports from a soldier who had witnessed an Alacrian mage emerging halfway through a portal before it collapsed. The mage had died within seconds. For now, the Trailblazer division remained focused on eliminating corrupted beasts and the individuals controlling them. Blaine frowned at the implications. If the enemy could no longer rely on teleportation gates, then perhaps they would arrive by ship along the western coast instead. Should that happen, he argued, no amount of wall building would make any difference. Arthur quietly noted the irony. Even Blaine, one of the strongest supporters of the wall's defense, was now questioning its effectiveness. His thoughts drifted back to his previous life. There, disputes between nations had rarely escalated into full-scale wars. Instead, rulers often settled conflicts through paragon duels. Despite all the lessons Lady Vera had drilled into him, and despite the countless strategic board games she had forced him to master, the reality before him felt far heavier than any theoretical exercise. Noticing the exhausted silence filling the chamber, Varian clapped his hands together. He acknowledged that there was much to consider, but argued that everyone needed rest. Clear minds made better decisions than exhausted ones. The council would reconvene at sunrise. Bund let out a long yawn and stretched his arms. He admitted that he would rather throw himself onto the battlefield and fight the enemy face to face than continue battling them from behind a meeting room table. With that, the lengthy meeting finally came to an end. One by one, the council members departed until only Arthur and Sylvie remained behind. Deep within, Arthur reflected that nothing truly prepared a person for the weight of conversations like those. The two made their way back to their room in silence, neither needing words to understand the burden the other carried. After removing everything except his inner shirt and trousers, Arthur sank into the couch. A subtle movement caught his attention. Turning his head, he watched as Sylvie's simple black dress shifted and swirled around her body as though it were alive. Curious, Arthur asked how she had managed it. Sylvie quietly explained that in her human form, she could mold her scales into clothing. To demonstrate, she transformed the lower half of her gown into a pair of pants. Leaning forward with interest, Arthur asked what else she could do. Taking a seat across from him, Sylvie explained that most of her efforts so far had been devoted to simply functioning in a bipedal body. Although she still found the lack of stability from her new legs frustrating, she admitted that she was beginning to understand why Asuras preferred this form. Intrigued, Arthur encouraged her to continue. For the first time that day, the conversation felt refreshingly normal. It was nice to speak with his bond as though the future of an entire continent was not resting on their shoulders. Sylvie explained that both mana manipulation and even the use of ether were easier in this form. As she spoke, she flexed and relaxed her fingers, seemingly fascinated by the sensation. Arthur found the revelation interesting and asked how the removal of the seal had affected her magical abilities. Sylvie explained that because the Indrath clan specialized in ether, most of her mana abilities focused on enhancing her body. However, she was also capable of releasing tremendous quantities of mana at once. As soon as she said it, mana began gathering in her open palm. A brilliant glow spread across the room. Arthur's eyes widened as the sphere of condensed mana steadily expanded. Growing alarmed, he urged Sylvie not to destroy either the room or the castle. At that, Sylvie's normally stoic expression broke into a smile. Amused by his reaction, she teasingly wondered whether the mighty lance had become frightened of a little girl. Arthur immediately pointed out that the jagged horns on her head made the description of little girl somewhat questionable. More seriously, he reminded her that she still occasionally stumbled over her own feet and suggested that endangering everyone in the castle was probably not the best idea. The glowing orb gradually faded away, dissolving into countless tiny particles. Sylvie released a deep breath. Although she was glad the seal had been broken because it would allow her to be more useful on the battlefield, a part of her felt unfamiliar to herself now. Arthur assumed it was simply a matter of adjusting to her human form and tried to reassure her. Sylvie shook her head. It was not her new body that troubled her. Rather, she felt something changing deep within. There seemed to be far more to her abilities than she had ever realized before. Arthur pointed out that she would have plenty of opportunities to discover those answers. Judging by everything discussed during the council meeting, the days ahead were only going to become more chaotic. Sylvie agreed, but found comfort in one thing. No matter how difficult things became, they would still have each other to rely on. Once she gained better control over her new form, she believed that defeating a scythe together might actually be possible. Arthur laughed at her careful wording. The odds still sounded far from favorable, but they were certainly much better than before. Hopeful, Sylvie suggested that perhaps they could spar before being sent on another mission. She wanted to test the limits of her control over ether in her human form. Arthur doubted they would be so lucky. With a yawn, he remarked that getting an uninterrupted night's sleep would already be an achievement. Dragging himself off the couch, he crossed the room and collapsed onto the bed. Moments later, a firm knock on the door jolted him awake. Sylvie immediately voiced her annoyance, pointing out that Arthur had managed to curse them almost instantly. From beyond the door came a deep voice apologizing for the disturbance and relaying a message from Commander Varian. Arthur was being summoned to the dungeon immediately. Before long, Arthur and Sylvie made their way through the castle. When they reached the reinforced entrance to the dungeon, they found the rest of the council already gathered outside. Still dressed in their sleepwear, the council members looked just as confused and irritated as Arthur felt. Varian announced that everyone had arrived. Bond immediately demanded to know what was happening. Alduin echoed the question, wondering why the matter could not have waited until morning. Varian explained that he had summoned everyone because of a man standing nearby. The burly man identified himself as Ento. Varian continued, explaining that Ento had reported that Gentry had finally managed to get one of the prisoners to talk. Priscilla immediately asked whether the prisoner in question was the retainer. Varian admitted that he was not entirely sure, casting an irritated look toward Ento. Arthur questioned why they were all still standing outside. If a prisoner was truly talking, then surely they should be inside already. He also asked where Gentry was. Ento assured them that Gentry would arrive shortly. Barely a minute passed, but Arthur's patience was already wearing dangerously thin. At last, the dungeon doors slid open. The hook-nosed elder emerged and trudged toward them. Blaine immediately demanded an explanation. Gentry apologized to both the council and Arthur. He explained that he had been performing maintenance on the retainer's restraining system when he had been summoned. Varian stepped forward eagerly. Convinced that a breakthrough had finally occurred, he pressed Gentry for answers. Had the retainer finally broken? What had he said? Gentry's response instantly crushed the anticipation. Unfortunately, the answer was no. Mariel's patience finally snapped. Unable to contain her frustration, she demanded to know why everyone had been dragged out of bed at such a miserable hour if Gentry had not actually broken the retainer. Gentry remained unfazed. He explained that while the retainer had yet to yield, another prisoner finally had. Thanks to his efforts, the traitor Radaeus had at last agreed to speak. However, there was one condition. Radaeus would only speak to General Arthur. The hallway fell silent. Every gaze slowly shifted toward Arthur as Gentry's long, crooked finger pointed directly at him. Bund erupted in outrage. He bitterly reminded everyone that Radaeus had split the Dwarven kingdom in two, tarnished its reputation, and then left the aftermath for others to clean up. In his eyes, the traitor had no right to make demands of anyone. Blaine wondered whether Radaeus was attempting to negotiate some sort of deal with Arthur. Mariel disagreed. If Radaeus merely wanted to bargain, she argued, he would have spoken with Virion or another member of the council instead. Virion considered the matter for a moment before offering a different possibility. Perhaps Radaeus specifically wanted Arthur because of his connection to Elijah. Arthur let out a weary sigh. That possibility was exactly what worried him. In his mind, the uncertainty surrounding Elijah remained a painful burden. They still had no idea where he was or what had happened to him. A dramatic cough from Gentry pulled everyone's attention back to the present. The elder pointed out that it had been extraordinarily difficult to get the traitor to speak at all. Since Radaeus was finally willing to talk, Gentry believed it would be wise to take advantage of the opportunity while it lasted. The council members turned their eyes toward Virion. After a brief moment, the commander gave a curt nod. Arthur agreed and instructed Gentry to lead the way. Together, they passed through the reinforced dungeon doors. The familiar musty scent of the castle dungeon immediately washed over Arthur, bringing back a flood of unpleasant memories from his own time imprisoned within those very walls. After passing through another heavily guarded entrance leading to the lower levels of the dungeon, where only Uto and Radaeus were imprisoned, Arthur followed Gentry to a barren cell scarcely larger than a closet. Once the old man departed, Arthur turned his attention to the shackled dwarf kneeling before him. He spoke Radaeus' name. The prisoner twitched at the sound, and then a slow smile spread across his pale face. Radaeus expressed gratitude for Arthur's presence and time before announcing that he wished to begin. Confused, Arthur asked what exactly he meant. Without answering directly, Radaeus launched into a dramatic tale. He spoke of a boy born into humble circumstances in a miserable little town, wrapped in rags but destined for far greater things. According to his story, the boy possessed both talent and strength. His mother taught him about the world, while his father taught him how to fight. Arthur could only stare as the dwarf continued his bizarre performance. Radaeus' voice gradually deepened as the tale progressed. He described how the boy eventually realized that a greater stage awaited him beyond his small hometown. His parents recognized the fire burning within him and understood they could no longer contain it, so they gathered their belongings and left in pursuit of a larger destiny. Then, as Radaeus put it, tragedy inevitably struck, yet the story continued. The boy endured heartbreak and suffering but persisted, growing stronger with each trial. However, every hero required an enemy, and every light cast a shadow. The dwarf then shifted toward a darker theme. He questioned what happened when a hero's enemy, having crossed both time and space, shone even brighter than the hero himself. Perhaps one person's noble champion was another person's destroyer. Perhaps concepts such as light and darkness were ultimately decided only by the victor. Still chained to the floor, Radaeus suddenly reached forward and clasped Arthur's hand with blood-crusted fingers. Arthur immediately tore his hand away. The force sent Radaeus collapsing onto the ground. Arthur stared down at him, uncertain whether he was dealing with a madman, a manipulator, or both. From the floor, Radaeus expressed relief. He explained that he had been worried Arthur might be another illusion. He had rehearsed the performance many times and would have hated for it to go to waste. He also remarked that he had almost forgotten how warm another person felt. Arthur observed that imprisonment appeared to have left him mentally unbalanced. Rather than taking offense, Radaeus found the choice of words amusing. Out of all the possible descriptions available, he found it fascinating that Arthur had chosen unbalanced instead of words like crazy, insane, mad, cracked, or nutty. Arthur's patience thinned. He stated that he had no interest in discussing vocabulary, especially with someone as unbalanced as Radaeus. The dwarf merely shrugged. Whether Arthur chose to heed his words or dismiss them was entirely his own decision, regardless of whether those words came in poetry or prose. Arthur attempted to steer the conversation back to the strange poem. Radaeus casually explained that an ordinary conversation seemed boring, since he was hardly a master poet. Composing verses had simply been a way to pass the time in his cell. The brief moment of apparent sanity vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. A mischievous glint returned to his eyes as he suggested that perhaps everything he had said was merely the rambling of an unbalanced man. Arthur sighed heavily and shook his head. Undeterred, Radaeus eagerly sought validation, wondering whether his rhymes had at least been memorable, even if they were somewhat simplistic. That was the final straw. In an instant, Arthur seized Radaeus by the neck and slammed him against the wall. His voice turned cold and sharp. Arthur warned him that he clearly failed to grasp the seriousness of his situation. He would remain imprisoned for a very long time, and that imprisonment would be deeply unpleasant. The extent of that unpleasantness depended entirely on how willing he was to cooperate and provide information that could help the council and Dicathen. After delivering the warning, Arthur released his grip and Radaeus slumped back down. Arthur made it clear that this was not the time to worry about whether his rhymes were catchy. Radaeus broke into a fit of coughing before finally responding. He insisted that he understood his situation perfectly. He had already said exactly what he wanted to say, and whatever Arthur chose to gain from those words was no longer his concern. With nothing more to be gained from the conversation, Arthur left the dungeon. He was relieved to escape both the stale air and the constant sound of Radaeus's humming. After the unexpected gathering dispersed, Arthur returned to his room. Despite his body desperately craving sleep, his mind remained fully awake. The strange poem continued to echo through his thoughts. Taking out a sheet of paper, he began writing down every part of the poem he could remember. Verse by verse, he reconstructed it, relying on its rhymes and structure whenever his memory faltered. His frustration grew with each passing moment. In his mind, Arthur admitted that he was so irritated he could barely think clearly. He could only hope he was remembering the poem correctly. At first glance, the central theme seemed obvious. It was a story about a hero. Yet the more he examined it, the more convinced he became that there was something deeper hidden beneath the surface. It almost felt as though the poem was about him. That realization disturbed him. How had Radaeus known details about his childhood? Arthur truly had grown up in a modest town in Ashbur, and the poem's description of the boy leaving his hometown before tragedy struck a line far too closely with reality. Perhaps Radaeus had used his position within the council to investigate Arthur's background. Even so, the explanation failed to satisfy him. Something about it felt wrong. His thoughts shifted to the darker portions of the poem. Did the line about brighter lights creating darker nights refer to his enemies growing stronger as he grew stronger himself? And what about the comparison between a knight and a blight? The meaning remained frustratingly elusive. Arthur remained skeptical that the poem held any genuine significance. Even so, his curiosity refused to let go, and eventually, exhaustion won out. Sliding into bed, he tried to clear his mind of the poem and the countless questions it had stirred. Yet even as sleep slowly claimed him, fragments of the verses continued drifting through his thoughts. Cersei held up 2 fingers before turning her full attention back to the tree in front of her. The crest on her back flared to life, and she pushed Fane's anxious prodding out of her mind as she focused on maintaining control over her powers. Mana flowed through her arms and into the tree, gradually shaping itself into a concealed beacon that would guide the Alacrian army through the mists. Fane impatiently asked how much longer it would take. Without looking away from her work, Cersei warned that her veiling barrier was already being stretched to its limits. Maintaining it over such a wide area was becoming increasingly difficult. At last, she felt the 3-point array stabilize within the tree. After waiting a moment to ensure it remained completely hidden, she released a relieved sigh and announced that the array had been successfully established. Maeve immediately praised the result and urged everyone to move before any elves discovered them. Using the power of her crest, Cersei expanded her senses roughly 30 yards ahead. After locating a path through the dense haze, she guided the group in a new direction. Maeve remained close beside her, practically attached to her side as they advanced. A few steps behind them, Cole stayed alert and ready to conjure a defensive barrier at the first sign of danger. Fane brought up the rear. Together they formed a team carefully assembled for this mission. Within her mind, Cersei reflected on how long they had been marching. She had lost track of the days. The constant tension was beginning to wear on everyone, and they were encountering more and more lost allies as they pushed deeper into the forest. Of all the teams assigned to the operation, she believed theirs had the highest chance of success. Her newly acquired emblem gave them a significant advantage. Suddenly, Maeve's arm shot out and pressed against Cersei's chest, bringing her to an immediate stop. Maeve silently pointed downward. Hidden beneath the fog was a shallow ditch filled with wooden spikes. Examining them closely, Maeve noted that the spikes had not simply been sharpened, they had been twisted into unusual shapes. Fane grumbled that Cersei had claimed the route was safe. Cersei explained that she would need to find a secure location before scouting another path. Avoiding her companion's eyes, she pressed onward. Navigating the forest was already difficult enough, without the growing doubt beginning to gnaw at the back of her mind. Eventually, the physical exhaustion from days of endless marching became strong enough to distract her from the fear that an elf might suddenly emerge from the trees and kill them all. When the group finally stopped for the night, Cersei offered a quiet prayer of thanks. Maeve pointed out that they had failed to place as many arrays as they had hoped that day. Fane countered that they had still managed to push farther into the forest. Cersei added that keeping the arrays hidden was far more difficult than it appeared. Even the slightest mana leakage would allow the elves to detect them. Fane complained that they could have advanced even farther if Cersei had not been so slow. Ignoring the remark, Cersei accepted a piece of bread from Cole. Cole cheerfully informed her that he had saved the largest portion specifically for her. Within, Cersei reflected on her companions. Fane's hostility was irritating. Maeve's habit of treating her like a child was only slightly more irritating, yet neither came close to matching the discomfort caused by Cole's obvious interest in her. Cole immediately defended Cersei, pointing out that Fane had needed the rest just as much as anyone else. Fane dismissed the comment, insisting that he simply wanted the mission finished as quickly as possible. As the conversation died down, Cersei quietly reflected on the team's history. The others had trained together for years in preparation for this mission. She, however, had known them for only a few weeks. Had their original sentry not died at the same time she received her emblem, she would never have been part of the team at all. Maeve reminded the group that they could not safely travel any deeper into the forest until Cersei's emblem had recovered. Fane reluctantly agreed, pointing out that they were not the only team operating in the Elshire forest, while Cole tried to remain optimistic, suggesting that perhaps another squad had already succeeded in securing a route. Deep down, Cersei remained unconvinced. Out of all the teams, she believed theirs had the greatest chance of success. Even with her lack of experience, the emblem she had recently acquired gave them a distinct advantage. Informing the others that she would be unable to use her emblem again for another day after this, Cersei ignited it and activated True Sense. The sensation was as unpleasant as ever. It felt as though her consciousness had been torn from her body, leaving her exposed to a freezing storm. Like a wandering spirit, she drifted through the sky while narrowing her focus onto a single element. As she concentrated on wind mana, particles of ambient mana glowed green across her vision. Extending her senses farther and farther outward, Cersei endured a growing throb of pain that soon became unbearable. Maintaining the incorporeal state demanded everything she had, and before long, the emblem forcibly anchored her consciousness back inside her body. Cole immediately asked whether she had found anything. Cersei explained that the kingdom itself remained beyond her reach, but she had sensed a larger area of mana fluctuations roughly a day's journey away. Fane wondered if it might be a settlement, while Cole released a relieved sigh, pleased to know that their efforts had not been wasted. He enthusiastically praised Cersei's work. Even Fane offered a compliment, remarking that such a feat was exactly what one would expect from a member of the Millview bloodline. Until now, he admitted, he had questioned whether she truly belonged to that lineage. Before the remark could escalate into another argument, Cersei felt something change. Channeling mana into her crest, she expanded her awareness across a 30-yard radius. Almost immediately, several figures entered her senses. Elves. Fane silently asked how many. In response, Cersei raised 3 fingers and pointed toward their direction. Conversation ceased at once. Even protected by a 2-layered barrier, none of them wanted to risk being overheard. Later, Cersei quietly slipped away from camp and made her way to a small pond. Sitting at the water's edge, she dipped her feet into the cool water and began washing the grime from her hands. In her mind, she justified the brief escape. It felt worth it. She had taken precautions before leaving, and despite Maeve's constant concerns, they had successfully avoided every elven patrol they had encountered so far. Besides, she could hardly complete such an important mission while covered in blood and dirt. The peaceful silence did not last. A rustle of leaves echoed through the night, and Cersei immediately turned toward the disturbance. A moment later, Cole emerged from the bushes. Annoyed, she questioned why he had followed her and asked whether he could even maintain the barrier from this distance. Cole admitted that he could not, explaining that he had only wanted to make sure she was alright. Cersei quickly insisted that they return to camp. Neither of them should have been away from their posts, and she was certain Fane would skin her alive if he discovered they were both missing. Then everything changed. Footsteps echoed from below, causing Cersei to freeze. Instinctively, she held her breath and listened. The moment she turned toward the sound, dozens of mana-infused arrows exploded from the darkness. Cole reacted without hesitation. Barrier after barrier sprang into existence, intercepting the deadly volley before it could reach them. Panic surged through Cersei as she watched the attack unfold, and she immediately shouted for Cole to run. Cersei suddenly sensed 3 enemies approaching and urgently warned the others that they had to return to camp. She knew it was dangerous, but she was certain that Fane and Maeve would be prepared to fight. The Cole spun around and struck with his spear. The weapon carved through an elf's abdomen in a single powerful swing, cutting the soldier down instantly. 2 more elven soldiers emerged and unleashed another volley of arrows. Cole desperately raised barrier after barrier, struggling to block the incoming attacks. At that moment, Fane arrived and drove his spear straight through one soldier's chest. At the same time, Maeve charged directly at the remaining enemy. She unleashed streak after streak of fire volleys that shot forward like arrows, piercing through the armored soldier from every direction. The instant all 3 enemies fell dead, Fane rounded on Cersei in fury and demanded an explanation for what had happened. Fear and embarrassment overtook Cersei, leaving her stammering as she struggled to respond. Before she could explain, Maeve cut Fane off and insisted that explanations could wait because they needed to leave immediately. Everyone agreed and turned to go, but Cersei suddenly froze. A violent shiver ran through her body as though her feet had become rooted to the ground. Maeve noticed her reaction and called out to her with concern. Bewilderment filled Cersei as she stammered out a warning. More elves were coming, and this time, there were a lot of them. Grey stepped back as Lady Vera positioned the thin metal weapon she called a foil for a horizontal swing. Even so, the strike somehow snapped against his left arm. Hissing through the fresh sting, Grey rubbed the new wound and insisted that he had thought he had dodged the attack. Lady Vera remained perfectly still as she explained that he was focusing too much on her weapon. According to her, his vision should encompass his opponent or opponents as a whole. She then challenged him to identify what was different at that moment. Grey glanced at the foil, still pointed at him, and dryly noted the obvious. The remark earned him another sharp smack from the weapon. Lady Vera warned him not to get clever with her. Several months had passed since Grey's capture and subsequent rescue by Lady Vera. After fully recovering from his injuries, he had begun training under her. Her methods were ruthless, and her personality possessed all the warmth of a block of ice. Lady Vera pressed for an answer, snapping him out of his thoughts. Grey observed that she had pivoted on her lead leg and brought her back foot forward to extend her reach. Lady Vera approved of the answer, adding that if he had not been able to deduce that from the track marks on the ground, Grey completed the familiar statement himself, knowing he would not deserve to be her student. A moment later, Lady Vera smacked the back of his head and praised him. Despite her harshness, Grey privately admitted that she was an exceptionally effective tutor. Her home alone spoke volumes about her wealth and influence. Later, they arrived at a clear pond filled with living fish. Grey asked how he could improve. Lady Vera instructed him to catch a fish with his bare hands without using chi. The suggestion left Grey baffled. He pointed out that the fish would die if removed from the water and added that he certainly could not afford to replace one. Stammering slightly, Lady Vera dismissed his concern and simply told him to try. Grey reached into the pond and attempted to scoop up a fish. The instant his fingers touched the water's surface, a gold and black fish shot away to the opposite side of the pond. Amazed by its speed, Grey could only marvel at how fast it was. Lady Vera snapped her fingers, demanding another attempt. Gray plunged his hands into the pond over and over. After more than a dozen tries, however, he had failed to even brush against the fish's scales. Finally surfacing in frustration, he demanded to know the purpose of the exercise. Lady Vera merely laughed. Gray argued that catching one of the fish with bare hands was impossible. In a haughty tone, Lady Vera questioned whether that was truly the case. Gray confidently insisted that it was, only to lift his head and find a writhing, glistening fish resting in Lady Vera's hand. His confidence instantly vanished. Shocked, he demanded that she do it again. Lady Vera shrugged and tossed the fish back into the pond before casually agreeing. Gray scrambled to his feet and watched intently, determined to make sure his mentor did not secretly use Kai or cheat in some other way. The fish swam directly beneath Lady Vera's waiting hand. With the slightest twitch of her fingers, she closed her fist around it, securing the fish in a grip that was firm yet gentle. Gray muttered that he did not understand. The movement had looked so slow. A sudden suspicion struck him, and he wondered if she had somehow trained the fish to swim into her hand. Lady Vera gave him a flat look and questioned whether she appeared to be the sort of person who would waste her time on something so pointless. After scratching his head, Gray reluctantly admitted that she probably was not. Lady Vera then explained that she had done it to demonstrate that Gray and the fish, the very creatures that had made a fool of him, were actually similar. The moment she finished speaking, her hand shot toward his face. Gray immediately jerked his head aside, narrowly avoiding another smack. Lady Vera explained that Gray's reaction speed was exceptionally fast, frighteningly fast in fact. However, she pointed out that it was purely instinctive and untamed, much like the fish in the pond. Confused, Gray asked what she meant by untamed. Lady Vera elaborated that by the time an opponent's muscles flexed to throw a punch, Gray's brain had already sent signals to his body to respond. Against students or inexperienced fighters, that ability gave him a tremendous advantage. However, if left untrained, stronger opponents would easily predict how he would dodge. She compared it to how she had anticipated the fish's movement and known it would surge forward when she reached for it. Gray considered her words and quickly realized they made perfect sense. He then asked how he was supposed to tame that ability. Lady Vera answered that he needed to learn to respond rather than merely react. Gray questioned whether there was any difference between the two. Patting him on the head, Lady Vera explained that one was intentional while the other was instinctive. Until now, their training had focused on basic conditioning, but she believed he was finally ready to begin learning how to respond to attacks instead of simply reacting to them. The prospect immediately excited Gray, who regarded it as the fun part of training. Lady Vera dryly informed him that it would be fun for her. Unfortunately for him, it was also time to return to school. She intended to continue the exercise the following day, but she suddenly stopped speaking and looked past Gray's shoulder. A young woman from the household staff hurried over with urgent news. She informed Gray that there was an emergency call from Nico. An explosion had apparently occurred at Vitholm, and the enforcers had locked down the school, ordering all students and staff to stay away until further notice. The news made Gray's stomach plummet. Sensing his alarm, Lady Vera calmly reminded him that a panicked man could drown in a puddle, while a calm man could swim across an ocean. Forgetting himself, Gray immediately took several hurried steps toward the house before remembering to ask permission. Lady Vera simply waved him on. She instructed him to go check on his friend and return afterward. Since classes were apparently canceled for the day, they could continue working on his reactions later. Gray sprinted into the house and grabbed the receiver. Breathing hard, he urgently asked Nico what had happened and whether he was all right. Nico immediately launched into a frantic explanation. He believed a KE restrainer had malfunctioned. He had inspected it only a few days earlier and was certain it had been functioning properly. Unable to understand what had gone wrong, he blamed himself for everything. Gray struggled to follow the panicked explanation and demanded to know what had actually happened and why Nico thought it was his fault. Nico revealed that the incident involved Cecilia. She had suffered one of her accidents. He begged Gray to come to the school, explaining that enforcers were everywhere, conducting interviews and asking endless questions. Fear gripped him as he worried that Cecilia might be taken away. Gray's first concern was whether Cecilia had been hurt. Learning that she was still alive brought immediate relief. However, Nico explained that the situation was still serious. He feared the authorities might imprison her. According to him, the damage was severe enough that she had demolished part of the administration building. Gray hesitated. Part of him wondered whether Lady Vera would allow him to go to the academy if he asked. Deep down, he already knew the answer. She would likely tell him to stay focused on his own path and leave the matter to the enforcers. In the end, Gray explained that the school had ordered everyone to stay away. Even if he wanted to help, he doubted they would allow him inside. Unwilling to give up, Nico suggested meeting somewhere else. They needed to prepare in case the authorities tried to take Cecilia away. Gray interrupted him and urged him to calm down. Reminded of Lady Vera's advice, he awkwardly repeated the lesson about a panicked man drowning in a puddle while a calm man could cross oceans. Nico listened, but the desperation in his voice remained as he asked where they could meet. Gray apologized to Nico and explained that he could not come. His lessons took priority, but he assured his friend that everything would be fine. He urged Nico to keep his head down and avoid causing trouble. Trying to offer some optimism, Gray suggested that the incident might even turn out to be beneficial. Perhaps someone would finally notice Cecilia's condition and provide her with help so she would no longer have to rely solely on... Gray stopped himself before finishing the thought. In his mind, the rest of the sentence lingered unspoken. She would no longer have to depend entirely on Nico's inventions. Nico accepted the answer and apologized in return. He acknowledged that Gray already had enough to deal with while pursuing his goal of becoming king and reluctantly said his goodbye. Before ending the call, Gray asked Nico to contact him as soon as the enforcers decided what action they intended to take. Nico agreed, and moments later, the line went dead. Gray remained seated alone for a while, thinking about Nico and Cecilia. He repeatedly assured himself that everything would be alright. Deep down, however, he recognized that repeating those words did not necessarily make them true. Arthur opened his eyes and released a long breath. Only a few days had passed since the previous dream, or memory, or whatever these visions truly were, and this one had been particularly unpleasant. It was a memory he would never forget, regardless of whether he relived it in dreams. After getting dressed, Arthur headed down toward the prison cells to pay Rhaeus a brief visit. Hopefully, the old prisoner would be coherent enough to repeat the poem, or better yet, provide a straightforward explanation. Outside the large metal door sat Albold Chaffer, the young elf Varian had introduced during an earlier visit. At the moment, the guard appeared to be dozing at his post. Smirking, Arthur erased his presence and softened his breathing. He coded his footsteps in mana with the same precision he had once practiced during his solitary training in the forests of Epheotis. Carefully, he crept toward the sleeping guard. The instant he came within a few yards of the door, Albold's eyes snapped open. Mana surged across his body, and his twin swords flashed through the air in a swift crossing strike. The attack halted immediately when he recognized Arthur. Albold quickly sheathed his blades and apologized, explaining that he had sensed someone sneaking up on him. Arthur pointed out that he had indeed been sneaking up on him, and suspiciously noted that Albold had appeared to be asleep. Embarrassed, the elf admitted that he had been caught. Looking down at his feet, he pleaded with Arthur not to mention it to Commander Varian. He only had a few days of guard duty remaining, and could not bear staying there any longer. Arthur chuckled and assured him that he had no intention of reporting him. In fact, he was impressed. Varian had been right about Albold's senses. Albold sheepishly admitted that those senses had saved him more than a few times throughout his life. As Arthur passed through the metal door, Albold hurried after him and asked whether he was there to visit another prisoner. He offered to escort him. Arthur explained that he was actually visiting the same prisoner as before and asked whether Gentry was inside. With a laugh, Albold remarked that he could not remember a time when Gentry had not been inside. Arthur immediately wondered whether the man actually slept there despite the terrible smell. Albold confirmed that he did. The thought alone made both of them shudder in disgust. Arthur then asked whether Albold at least had his own room somewhere far away from what he privately regarded as the depths of despair. Albold enthusiastically assured him that he did. More importantly, he could not wait to finish his assignment and return home. Curious, Arthur asked whether he was leaving field duty altogether. Scratching his head, Albold quickly clarified that he was not. He would still be serving on duty, but he would be back in the forest. That was what he considered home. A small laugh escaped him as he said it. Arthur remarked that he understood. He recalled his first visit to Elshire Forest, explaining that he had been only a child at the time, and that the trip had happened entirely by accident. Albold seemed surprised. Few humans had ever entered the forest and lived to tell the tale. Arthur offered to share the story if Albold was willing to explain what had gotten him demoted. Laughing, Albold declined the trade and remarked that in that case, neither of them would ever know. The elf led Arthur deeper into the prison, and before long they found Gentry asleep on a cot inside one of the nearby cells. Startled awake, Gentry groggily asked what was happening. Upon recognizing Arthur, he sarcastically wondered what he had done to deserve the honor of having his rest interrupted. With a smirk, Arthur informed him that he was simply returning the favor. He then asked if Gentry could open Rhaeus' cell for a moment, because he had something he wanted to ask the old dwarf. Gentry readily agreed. As he moved to unlock the door leading to the lower level of the dungeon, he once again apologized for summoning the entire council. He explained that he had genuinely believed the traitor was about to reveal something important. Arthur admitted that it was possible Radaeus had intended to reveal something after all. There were still a few questions he wanted answered. After several clicks echoed through the corridor, Gentry motioned for Albold to assist him. Together, they pulled the heavy doors open. The moment the entrance opened, all three men froze. Gentry's assistant lay sprawled across the floor, several black spikes protruding through his body. Arthur's eyes immediately shifted away from the corpse and toward the cell where Udo had been imprisoned. The vault door stood open. Inside, the retainer's body had been impaled and torn apart by jagged black spikes. A grin remained plastered across his face. Arthur's heart slammed against his chest. Mana instantly surged around him as he threw himself in front of Gentry and Albold, expecting Uto to attack at any moment. But the retainer remained completely motionless. Gentry cried out upon seeing his assistant's body, oblivious to everything else around him. Arthur muttered that the man was dead, his attention fixed entirely on Uto. In his mind, possibilities raced through him. Had Uto somehow escaped and killed himself? No, that made no sense. The retainer's body was still there. Then who had done this? Suddenly remembering Radaeus, Arthur rushed into the dungeon. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt the restrictive wards draining away the mana protection surrounding him. Leaping over the assistant's corpse, he threw open the door to Radaeus' cell. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The old dwarf had suffered the same fate as Ento and Uto. Radaeus was dead. Arthur knew that the sudden deaths of both Radaeus and Uto would send shockwaves through every level of the noble families, both inside the castle and beyond its walls. Because they had been the ones to discover the scene, Gentry, Albold, and Arthur were all subjected to extensive questioning by the council. Priscilla acknowledged Gentry's distress and gently urged him to continue his testimony. Overcome with grief, Gentry broke down, blaming himself for what had happened. He insisted that he could have stopped it if only he had not been asleep. Blaine immediately asked whether he had heard anything unusual during the night. Before Gentry could answer, Albold assured the council that any struggle would have reached his ears. Even from the first floor of the dungeon, he was confident he would have heard it. Arthur reiterated what he had already reported. By the time they arrived, the victims had already been dead. Mariel then requested a precise account of what they had witnessed. Fighting through his emotions, Gentry described entering the room and finding black spikes scattered everywhere. Ento's body had been hanging from one of them. Albold continued the account, explaining that Uto had been found partially outside his cell with a spike driven through his core. It had been impossible to determine whether the retainer had escaped on his own or whether someone had helped him. While Albold had wanted to investigate further, Arthur had gone directly to question Radaeus. Arthur picked up from there, explaining that he had intended to ask Radaeus several questions about the poem. However, the dwarf had already been dead when he arrived. Like the others, he had been impaled through the middle by black spikes. Arthur then laid out the facts as clearly as possible. Gentry had been sleeping near the room, while Albold had been guarding the main entrance. Earlier that same morning, Albold had detected Arthur's presence despite Arthur concealing his mana. In addition, numerous guards had been stationed between the dungeon entrance and the prisoners. If someone had infiltrated the castle and carried out the murders, they had somehow done so without leaving behind a single trace. After hearing the testimonies, Varian announced the council's conclusion. Since all witness accounts matched perfectly, none of the three were considered involved in the deaths. Gentry was granted bereavement leave until the council required his presence again. Albold was ordered to return to Elshire Forest and assist the forces stationed there. Arthur was instructed to remain on standby for any future needs. Arthur bowed and accepted the order. Keeping a powerful Alacrian prisoner captive had provided the people of Dicathen with a sense of control and security. While none of the council members mourned Radaeus himself, the knowledge he had carried to the grave represented a significant loss. To avoid panic and maintain stability, the council resorted to a tactic used by countless leaders throughout history when faced with similar failures. They buried the truth. As for Arthur, he now stood before Varian inside the commander's private office. Arthur assumed Varian must be concerned about everyone's safety. After all, 3 people had been murdered, likely by enemy forces, inside what was supposed to be the most secure location in all of Dicathen. Varian immediately challenged that assumption. If he truly believed the castle was unsafe, he would never allow people to remain there. Arthur had to admit the logic was sound. If an intruder could freely enter the castle, why target prisoners instead of attempting to assassinate members of the council or one of the lances? The entire situation made little sense. His thoughts drifted back to Agrona's words. Agrona had claimed that the purpose of the war was to conquer the continent while minimizing casualties. He wanted the resources of Dicathen, both living and non-living, to strengthen his own forces before launching an assault against Ephiatus. That line of thinking led Arthur to another troubling possibility. Had Rhaeus uncovered something important? Had the dwarf intentionally hidden information within a poem in an attempt to bypass a curse? And if so, was it the same kind of curse that had killed Cynthia? Virion admitted that he was at a loss. The war they were fighting was unlike anything Dicathen had ever experienced in scale, yet something about the current situation felt wrong. Arthur immediately understood what he meant. Everything had been too quiet. He agreed that it felt as though something enormous was approaching. The problem was that neither of them knew exactly what it was. After the conversation ended, Arthur left Virion's office and headed toward his room. As he walked through the castle corridors, his thoughts continued to churn. Events were moving at an alarming pace. Part of him questioned whether he should really remain on standby while the other lances were actively engaged elsewhere. Aya was stationed in El Noir. Mika was investigating a radical group in Darbite. Varai was overseeing the fortification of major cities along the western coast. Baron was scouting the northern reaches of the Grand Mountains in search of any signs of retainers or scythes. Arthur, meanwhile, remained at the castle. Still, he refused to doubt Virion's judgment. There had to be a reason for the assignment. Since he was stuck there for the time being, he decided he might as well use the opportunity productively. Several minutes later, he arrived outside his room. A faint voice drifted through the door. It sounded like Ellie. The words were too quiet to fully make out, but it sounded as though she was asking for help and seeking a promise. When Arthur entered, Ellie greeted him with a weak smile, while Sylvie offered nothing more than a simple wave. That immediately struck Arthur as suspicious. Before he could dwell on it, Sylvie's voice echoed through their bond, accusing him of overthinking. The response only made him even more suspicious. Ellie quickly changed the subject and asked why he had been gone for so long. Arthur vaguely attributed it to more meetings before informing her that he was finally free. Ellie's mood brightened immediately. She asked whether that meant he would finally spend some time with his precious little sister. Arthur agreed, provided she did not mind spending that time at the training grounds. Both he and Sylvie had things they wanted to test before facing real combat. To his surprise, Ellie enthusiastically declared that she had been about to suggest the exact same thing and immediately grabbed her bow. As they headed toward the training grounds, Arthur privately asked Sylvie through their bond whether she intended to explain what she and Ellie had been discussing earlier. Sylvie's response was simple, that she was sworn to secrecy. As he pushed open the doors to the training grounds, a small smile formed on his face. Deep down, he was glad that Ellie and Sylvie had grown close enough to confide in one another. Arthur smiled and instructed everyone to get some stretches in before they began. He glanced at Sylvie and told her to prepare as well, explaining that he wanted to see what she could do before they entered an actual battle. Sylvie questioned whether it was all right to demonstrate her abilities with so many people present. Arthur assured her that they would hold back, adding that if they truly intended to go all out, they would need to find a very large, uninhabited valley somewhere far away. While stretching, Sylvie stumbled, but Ellie quickly caught her before she could fall. Laughing at the sight, Arthur announced that the real training could finally begin. Sylvie took her position, and Arthur asked how she wanted to approach the session. Rather than answering directly, Sylvie told him to stay still for a moment. A glowing orb formed between her hands. As soon as she released it, the translucent sphere stretched and sharpened into the shape of an arrow before shooting toward Arthur. He stepped aside to avoid the attack and caught it in his palm. The mana arrow immediately dissolved into smoke over his hand. Surprised, Arthur recognized it as a mana arrow and wondered when she had learned to create such a spell. Sylvie explained that watching Ellie use elementless mana had given her several ideas on how to make the best use of her own natural traits. Repeating the process, she formed another arrow and fired it at him. Arthur caught the incoming projectile once more. In his mind, he noted that it was far denser than Ellie's mana arrows, almost solid in comparison. While the raw power behind the spell was not particularly high, Sylvie had compressed an enormous amount of mana into an incredibly dense form. Because of that, it did not dissipate immediately upon contact. Although the inspiration for the attack had clearly come from observing Ellie, the composition of the two spells was entirely different. meant. Sylvie went on to explain that dragons could only manipulate ether and pure mana, but there was something she still did not understand. Arthur asked what she meant. Sylvie admitted that she was not entirely sure herself. Since spending time in her current form, she had gained a much better understanding of her core. Even so, there remained a part of it that she still could not access. Arthur suggested that perhaps she would be able to reach it once she grew stronger. For now, he decided it would be better to test how versatile her control over pure mana truly was. Dozens of fireballs materialized around him and floated through the air. With a wave of his hand, the blazing cloud surged towards Sylvie. The projectiles converged on her position and exploded at once. Scorching heat engulfed her completely, but the attack failed to leave even the slightest mark. Sylvie merely yawned as a mana barrier surrounded her body like a protective shell. Arthur responded by conjuring a series of fire arrows. He instructed Sylvie to create individual panels and block each projectile separately. Sylvie raised her hand and effortlessly formed several small mana shields, each one intercepting a fire arrow with perfect precision. Arthur immediately dashed forward and swept past her. As he swung a stick at her side, Sylvie reacted by raising her arm. Shimmering scales instantly formed over her skin, and the stick rebounded from the impact. Arthur's eyes lit up with delight. He observed that her mana control was excellent, and that her mana reserves were remarkably large. Even in her human form, her scales provided impressive physical defense, though she was somewhat slower than usual. Despite those advantages, he concluded that her attack still lacked the power necessary to threaten retainers and scythes. Sylvie pointed out that her innate defenses were actually weaker in this form. Arthur had held back that strike, but if he had attacked seriously with Dawn's Ballad, she would have lost a limb. While her control over mana was much better in her current state, her dragon form allowed her to unleash far greater amounts of mana at once, albeit in a far less refined manner. Arthur nodded in understanding before deciding to test a few more things. He asked Sylvie to conjure a square mana panel in front of him. After the panel formed, Arthur instructed her to keep it stable. Pulling his fist back, he drove a punch into the construct. The mana panel trembled from the impact but remained firmly in place. Pleased, Arthur moved on to another test and asked how far away she could maintain control over a spell. In response, Sylvie stretched out a hand and dismissed the panel he had struck. The mana reshaped itself into a glowing bubble and shot toward the far wall of the room. Arthur instructed her to move it left while he concentrated on the shining orb. Under Sylvie's control, the spell smoothly darted to the side and stopped just before colliding with the wall. He then had her bring it back and transform it into an arrow. Arthur guided Sylvie through a series of increasingly complex exercises, gradually increasing the number of mana constructs she had to manage simultaneously. By the end of the drill, sweat poured down her face, but Arthur had gained a clear understanding of how they could coordinate together in battle. Satisfied, he told Sylvie to get some rest and called Ellie forward for her turn. Ellie hurried up at once, grabbing her bow as she strode eagerly into position. Before leaving, Sylvie exchanged a high five with her and then settled onto Boo to rest. Lying comfortably on the bear, Sylvie sent Arthur a telepathic message, noting that his sister clearly wanted to impress him and asking him not to be too hard on her. Arthur glanced at his bond and lamented that there was no fun in that. Turning his attention back to the training, he touched the ground. The earth immediately responded as jagged rocks burst upward and surged toward Ellie. Before they could reach her, however, arrows formed entirely from mana shot forward and shattered the incoming stone into countless pieces. Ellie turned back toward Arthur with a smug grin and made it clear that he would have to do much better than that. Arthur exchanged a glance with Sylvie before shaking his head. It seemed he might not even get the opportunity to be hard on his sister. Without wasting time, Arthur released a volley of fireballs and hurled them toward Ellie. She responded instantly, firing dozens of mana arrows that dispersed the incoming flames before they could reach her. Deciding to increase the difficulty, Arthur moved on to something more challenging. He conjured a flock of birds made of ice and sent them flitting through the air while Ellie attempted to shoot them down. Although some of these spells had little practical use in actual combat, the exercise helped him push the limits of his own abilities and better understand what he could accomplish within a given amount of time. After observing her performance, Arthur decided to raise the stakes even further. With a sweep of his arm, a twisting current of fire emerged and began taking shape. The flames gathered into the form of a massive bear. The ground hissed and sizzled wherever its burning paws touched as Arthur directed the fiery construct toward Ellie. Beside him, Boo tilted his head curiously while watching the blazing imitation of himself. Arthur pointed out that Ellie's offense was impressive, but questioned how she would handle a spell that could not simply be shot down with arrows. In response, Ellie merely grinned and drew her bow. A shimmering white arrow materialized against the bowstring. Just before she released it, a faint ripple traveled along its shaft. The mana arrow shrieked through the air and struck the flaming bear. Arthur had expected it to pass harmlessly through the spell, but the moment it connected, the entire arrow erupted into a brilliant ray of light and completely dispersed the construct. Arthur blinked in surprise. Ellie immediately supplied several possible descriptions for what he was about to say, confidently suggesting that her attack had been impressive, superb, or even jaw-dropping. Rolling his eyes, Arthur settled on a far more restrained assessment. He admitted that it was not bad, and noted that because her arrows were formed entirely from pure mana, her reload and draw speed were considerably faster than those of a traditional archer. Ellie complained that his compliments seemed rather dull. Before Arthur could respond, Sylvie explained that what he truly meant was that he was very proud of how much Ellie had grown. Arthur immediately flicked Sylvie on the head and protested against her habit of verbally expressing his thoughts. Despite that, a smile remained on his face as he told Ellie that her stamina still needed improvement. However, he assured her that with enough training and experience, she would eventually overcome that weakness. Ellie glanced toward Sylvie before looking back at her brother. Hesitation crossed her face as she tried to bring up another subject. Arthur raised a brow, clearly expecting her to finish what she wanted to say, but Ellie lost her nerve and muttered that it was nothing. Sylvie shook her head and encouraged her to simply say it. Arthur then wondered if this had anything to do with the conversation the two of them had been having before Ellie returned from her meeting. Unable to avoid the subject any longer, Ellie finally admitted that she wanted to start helping in the war. Even though Arthur had anticipated this request, his heart still sank. When he remained silent, Ellie hurriedly continued. She reminded him that he himself had acknowledged how much stronger she had become. She was confident that she surpassed many of the soldiers already assigned to squads. She added that she was willing to remain among the reserves and that, as an archer, she would be stationed in the rear rather than on the front lines. Arthur cut her off before she could continue. He told Ellie that he could clearly see how hard she had been working and emphasized that he was not outright refusing her request. At the same time, he was not certain that he was the one who should be making such a decision for her. Their parents were not there, and to be honest, he and Ellie had not exactly been seeing eye to eye lately. Ellie asked whether Arthur still had not made up with their parents since leaving to train. Surprised, Arthur wondered how she had known. Ellie frowned and pointed out that being young did not make her stupid. Realizing his mistake, Arthur apologized. After letting out a sigh, he finally relented. He proposed that the two of them go on a mission together. If Ellie performed well, he would give her his blessing. While he could not speak on behalf of their parents, he promised that he would not be the one standing in her way. Ellie's face immediately brightened, and she eagerly accepted before thanking him. Sylvie approved of the arrangement through their bond, remarking that Arthur had been very fair. Arthur responded with a smile toward his companion. At that moment, Queen Mariel entered the training room and remarked that it looked as though another member of the Leywin family was trying to help the continent. Arthur, Ellie, and Sylvie immediately bowed in greeting. Mariel greeted all three of them and encouraged them to continue training, assuring them there was no need to stop on her account. Arthur asked what had brought her to the training room so late in the evening. Mariel explained that she occasionally checked on the children who trained there. Many of them were good kids, and quite a few were citizens of Elenoir. She admitted that she had not expected the room to be completely empty, and apologized for overhearing what appeared to be a family conversation. Arthur assured her that it was no problem and insisted that the discussion had not been particularly serious. Mariel disagreed, remarking that it had sounded quite serious to her. Arthur hesitated, and Mariel continued by observing that everyone was doing what they could to help in the war. She commented on Ellie's bravery and noted that she must take after her brother. The young girl reminded her a little of Tessia. That memory prompted Mariel to ask whether Arthur remembered the time Tessia had overheard the castle chefs complaining about cured meat disappearing. Arthur chuckled at the recollection. Of course he remembered. Tessia had dragged him into investigating the mystery with her, and together they had caught Virion red-handed stealing meat despite supposedly being on a diet. Mariel laughed warmly. She recalled that Tessia had invited her to join the investigation, but she had been too occupied with tri-union discussions at the time. Back then, she had believed those meetings were the worst of her troubles. Looking back now, however, those days had been among the most peaceful moments of their lives. She reflected that they probably should have appreciated them more. With that, Mariel remarked that it had been good running into him and turned to leave. Before she could depart, Arthur called out to her. Speaking firmly, he promised that, with the council's guidance, the Lances and he would do everything in their power to ensure that those peaceful times could return once again. Mariel offered no response. She remained silent and quietly left the room. The next 4 days passed in the blink of an eye. Arthur spent most of that time on the training grounds, relentlessly drilling both Ellie and Sylvie until they were exhausted mentally and physically. At the same time, he continued exploring the capabilities of his new powers, steadily pushing beyond previous limitations and uncovering new possibilities with each passing day. Arthur experimented with raising earthen soldiers, attempting to replicate the technique once used by Ulfrid, the traitorous dwarven lance. However, after creating 3 simple humanoid golems, his control over them deteriorated to the point that they merely mimicked one another's movements. At the same time, Ellie continued improving her ability to use pure mana without relying on her mana reserves. The training proved beneficial for Arthur as well. It was a refreshing change of pace, and he could feel the control granted by his white core becoming steadily more refined with each passing day. Although Sylvie had yet to unlock any additional abilities hidden within her core, and the two of them still had not practiced coordinated combat, both she and Ellie made significant progress under Arthur's careful instruction. Following their morning drills, target practice for Ellie, and manosphere multitasking exercises for Sylvie, they took a break. Arthur remarked that it had been an enjoyable session. Sylvie immediately disagreed, huffing that it had only been enjoyable for him. Ellie turned to Sylvie and commented on how impressive her pure mana attacks had become. They were growing increasingly versatile and could even stand up well against Arthur's elemental spells. Arthur flicked Ellie on the head and reminded her not to compare herself to Sylvie. After all, Sylvie was a dragon, and pure mana was the primary form of energy dragons could manipulate. Sylvie quickly added that dragons could also manipulate ether. Arthur acknowledged the correction before explaining the difference. For ordinary mages, pure mana came only from their cores and required time to gather and purify. Elemental magic also drew mana from the core, but it was supplemented by the ambient mana that naturally surrounded them. Pure mana spells, however, always had to originate directly from the caster and became much harder to control once released. That was why Ellie's ability to detonate an arrow after firing it was so impressive. Ellie's face lit up with delight at the praise. Energized, she immediately asked Sylvie to create those moving mana panels again because she wanted to practice hitting them. Sylvie agreed, reasoning that she should also continue practicing her reactions against Ellie's arrows. Feeling more content than he had in quite some time, Arthur watched the two run off together. Then beyond them, the doors to the training room suddenly burst open. A lone guard rushed inside. One look at the man's expression was enough for Arthur to know that the news he carried was not good. The guard hurried over and informed General Arthur that reports of a massive corrupted beast horde had arrived from the wall. Commander Virion was already waiting for him at the dock alongside a team of mages. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.